Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where gas lamps flicker past midnight and the tick of a grandfather clock is loud enough to make your teeth itch. The air outside your window is thick with London's infamous pea soup fog, and from the next room you can hear the muffled tossing and turning of another restless soul. You tuck yourself into crisp linens, the kind that promise more comfort than they deliver, and try counting sheep. But Victorian sheep, mind you, with bows tied around their necks. Your eyelids droop, then snap open again, just as the street vendor's bell clangs in the distance. Yes, tonight is about sleepless nights, and I have to warn you, you probably won't survive this journey with your attention intact, because even as the Victorians suffered a hidden epidemic of insomnia, you may find yourself fighting the urge to doze off from sheer historical boredom. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And since we're turning Victorian sleep troubles into a worldwide bedtime ritual, post your location and local time below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You roll back the years to the 1800s. Victorian England is a world alive with technological ambition and midnight anxieties. Sleep isn't just something that happens. It's something people fret over with a seriousness that nudges right up against melodrama. The medical journals and penny newspapers are full of panicked tales. Merchants, housewives, chimney sweeps, even lords and ladies, all plagued by the same frustration. Eyelids that refuse to close. By the mid-19th century, you can't walk through a market square or sit by a fireside without hearing someone complain about the horrors of a sleepless night. The insomnia epidemic has officially arrived, and society's response is surprisingly dramatic for such a mundane problem. Picture the night. You're lying in bed, the coals in your hearth reducing to a faint glow. Every square on the wall clock feels like an hour. You begin to notice the background thrum of your own heart, catalog every creak in the floorboards, and contemplate writing a letter to the Times to complain about how modern life is robbing people of rest. You're not alone. Across the city and the country, Victorians are suffering from what's been labeled the vanishing art of healthy sleep. Medical men exchange theories, newspapers fan the flames, and everyone starts wondering if, perhaps, civilization itself is to blame for their nightly misery. For years, sleep problems were mostly considered personal quirks. Some blamed liverishness, others an unfortunate alignment of the moon, or a stiff mattress stuffed with dubious hay. But at some point in the 1800s, the problem grew too big to ignore. It didn't help that the Industrial Revolution had turned day and night upside down. Factories clattered on deep into the dark, trains roared past suburban windows, and nighttime began to feel suspiciously like an extension of the workday. Even Queen Victoria herself was rumored to suffer occasional sleeplessness, though it was probably more from palace intrigue than the raucous neighbors next door. Rumors about sleeplessness spread as quickly as the London fog. It becomes almost fashionable to claim you haven't slept well in weeks, though that might be because the alternative is admitting you're less busy than your neighbor. The newspapers print stories about a new malady gripping the population, what they sometimes call modern nerves. You decide, perhaps, that if Charles Dickens openly admits to pacing his study late into the night, it's not so terrible to be wide awake at 3 a.m. with only your candle and a plate of cold mutton for company. The word insomnia is not especially new to you by this age in history, but the idea that it is a threat to civilization is starting to take hold. In posh households, hosts start apologizing for fitful nights. In less expensive homes, conversations over morning tea feature elaborate descriptions of suffering. I only managed to close my eyes at 3:15, and the postman woke me at dawn. To be tired in public is almost a contest. How little did you sleep? How ghastly do you look? A little melodrama goes far. Say you have the vapors, and it sounds suspiciously more glamorous than just being completely exhausted from the clang of the city trams. What's really going on? Historians still argue whether the so-called Victorian insomnia epidemic was something genuinely new, or just better documented and discussed than ever before. On one hand, there's real evidence that the creeping pace of industrial urban life did disrupt natural sleep patterns. This, after all, is the age when factory work shifts ignore sunrise and sunset entirely, and for the first time, gaslighting makes it possible to read or worry well past midnight. On the other hand, it's possible the Victorians just developed a new vocabulary to talk about something that's always plagued humankind, which is almost as revolutionary as inventing a new type of mattress without the springs. Meanwhile, physicians and the emerging army of sleep experts, yes, they had those too, long before weighted blankets, rush in to fill the void. You notice advertisements for remedies popping up everywhere, from tins of tinny cocoa to loud promises of electric sleep induction. The medical lectures are crowded with worried faces, and people even start holding sleep salons to discuss their woes over sherry and stiff biscuits. It gets to the point where your mother's sister's cousin has a sleep diary, and you're not entirely surprised when your postman asks about your evening regimen with a knowing wink. Of course, for every proper diagnosis, there's a healthy dose of superstition. Some people insist the air itself is different, thicker, more toxic, if you live downwind from the tanneries. Others blame those newfangled timepieces, which tick with a menacing regularity impossible to ignore. It's a world where the mundane meets the magical. A drafty corridor or an unlucky stare from a black cat might be blamed as quickly as a medical condition. But in the general frenzy, actual sleep continues to evade even the most careful Victorians. As you drift through this world, a quirky example leaps out. A group of well-to-do gentlemen in Hertfordshire decides to host a sleep trial, locking themselves away in a manor house to test which variety of feather pillow induces the best slumber. Spoiler alert, none of them do, and their diary ends up reading more like a comedy of errors than a scientific experiment. For the average Victorian, though, the answer is rarely so elaborate. You try anything, foot baths, endless mugs of hot milk, or even the ritualistic banging of your boots before bed to drive away invisible spirits. There's also a growing sense that sleeplessness is contagious. Not literally, but societally. Gossip in the parlor, concerns over the latest penny dreadful, and the endless whirl of the city life combine to make sleep seem almost mythical. You begin to wonder if not sleeping is, in a strange way, proof that you're really living, that you're tuned in to the drama of the era. After all, if Queen Victoria can't sleep and Dickens can't sleep, why should you be able to drift off before the milkman makes his rounds? Even so, mainstream science of the time starts to suggest some genuinely new ideas about why everyone's so tired. One famous doctor, Sir Henry Holland, announces that the nervous system is taxed by city life, which prompts a public debate. Are we too connected, too busy, too modern? Journals fill with letters from readers who insist that electric telegraphs are to blame, while others argue that it's the fault of foreign novels, strong tea, or simply the daily grind. The debate grows so heated that it sometimes seems as though sleeplessness is about to become a new branch of philosophy, one that involves a lot of yawning. By now, it's almost funny how complicated your evenings have become. What was once a simple act, closing your eyes, sinking into your bedding, floating off to sleep, transforms into a nightly ordeal. Sleep isn't just a health issue, it's a public conversation, a social worry, a kind of status symbol. And all the while, you can't help but feel like you're starring in your own Victorian melodrama, pen poised to write yet another tragic chapter about the night I didn't sleep. It's hard not to sympathize, even as you yawn your way through the telling. Victorians really did elevate sleeplessness into an art form, shaping not just how people talked about their own nighttime struggles, but also, in the process, how you might find yourself obsessing about your own rest. With every tick of the clock and every tale swapped at the morning table, the legend of the Victorian insomnia epidemic grows, part reality, part theatrical invention, wholly memorable, and perhaps just a little bit contagious. Word count, 122. You settle your mind into a Victorian bedroom, drafty, candlelit, and perhaps just a touch too chilly for comfort. Sleep will not come, at least not easily. But the year is 1856, and the clock on the mantel ticks on with maddening precision. Your body aches from a stiff mattress, and your thoughts swirl with the day's fusses. The thrum of iron wheels in the street, a neighbor's clacking shoes, your own restless tossing. In this age, you understand, insomnia is as common as the evening fog. But with the medical profession still sniffing warily at the problem, what on earth are you supposed to do? For now, you hope your family's tried and true tricks will drag you into slumber. If only they worked better. So you lie still. You're told, first and foremost, not to move. Folk wisdom insists that shifting about in bed would scatter your soul, or somehow rouse your animal spirits. No, that's not a rowdy band, though it does sound more fun than the truth. Victorians genuinely fret that each restless fidget stirs the body's invisible currents, tangling the possibility of rest. Maybe you try counting sheep, not as a joke, but as a serious method, handed down by your grandmother, the way a modern parent might pass on a family chili recipe. Still, as you count silent lambs leaping an imaginary hedge, you wonder, who came up with this, and did it ever really work? Or was it just better than worrying about whooping cough? If you're lucky, somebody brings you a posset. This concoction, equal parts hot milk and ale, sometimes sweetened and spiked with nutmeg, is one of the most beloved home remedies for sleepless adults and fretful children alike. You breathe in the slightly sour steam, tasting warmth rather than subtlety. The logic: milk soothes, ale dulls. Nutmeg supposedly chases away nightmares. The result: you spend half the night hoping the warm mug will knock you out, and the other half wanting to find whoever invented posset and request a refund. Still, the tradition persists, possibly because, as the local vicar says, a posset at least gives you something else to complain about. Not everyone in your family favors the sleepy time brew, Your aunt swears by lavender sachets stuffed into her pillows. You watch her fuss over the muslin packets, pausing to inhale and, for effect, shoo away evil spirits with a flick of her wrist. In the gentle candle glow, lavender smoke mingles with the smell of beeswax and damp stone. Some evenings you think you glimpse shadows dancing across the walls. Not ghosts, but woolen socks left to dry. For Victorians, the scent of lavender is less about spa-like serenity and more about warding off night airs, those miasmas believed to seep in after sunset, carrying with them the threat of both disease and bad dreams. By Victorian reasoning, why trust the doctor when a sachet might repel invisible terrors on the cheap? That's nothing compared to your neighbor's approach. He claims, quite proudly, that he always places a chunk of bread under his pillow each night. Bizarre. It gets better. The idea is that bread will absorb stray thoughts, acting as a bland little sponge for worries. You have to admire the logic. If bread grows stale untouched, perhaps it will stale away your anxieties too. Sometimes, he claims to mix it up, swapping in a potato or a slice of onion on particularly troubled nights. Your uncle once tried tucking a salt-filled pouch beneath his mattress, inspired by folk beliefs that salt purifies and cleanses. Historians still argue whether these habits were sincerely trusted or more social theater, a bit of shared superstition to keep the community's quirks humming along. But you, like many, dabble in stranger remedies. On moonlit evenings, your grandmother insists on opening the window so that the holy air might settle the house. Never mind the chill that sets your teeth chattering. This ritual, whispered across centuries, reflects a belief that fresh, night air had properties to lull and restore. It seems the Victorians enjoyed a good contradiction. Open the window for purity, then immediately blame the miasmas for any coughs or nightmares that followed. The ongoing debate about the dangers or virtues of the night breeze lingers even in somnolent towns, where elderly women gossip at market about which neighbors sleep with the sash cracked, bless them, and whose troubles are self-inflicted by stuffy rooms. Meanwhile, some have more elaborate rituals. You may find yourself, at your mother's urging, circling your bed 3 times while reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards. This isn't a standard spiritual exercise. It's insurance supposedly against witches, spirits, and whatever else might keep you awake. You're careful not to let the cat cross your path on the 3rd circle, though. After all, you never know if she's in league with the dark powers that give you insomnia, or if she's just hungry again. Of course, this rank superstition colors much of Victorian culture. One account describes a rural family who placed a broom across the threshold before bed, not to trip burglars, but to confuse any nocturnal spirits who could not count past 3. You suspect those spirits may have been smarter than they let on, or perhaps just bored. Another common technique, passed eagerly from neighbor to neighbor, involves sleep stones. The idea is deliciously simple. Smooth pebbles, chilled beside the window, are tucked into the palm or slipped under the sheet. As they gradually warm, your troubles are said to transfer into the stone. The trick is not to roll over. Nobody wants insomnia by pebble print. The tradition's popularity apparently spanned classes and regions, with some stones prized for family legacy, others for their supposed ability to prevent midnight devils from leaping onto your chest. It's never clear if anyone truly slept better, but the possibilities seemed endless. Place a bowl of water beside your bed, too. It was thought to catch bad dreams. or perhaps just provide an excellent excuse to get up and pee. Not all remedies are so soft. Should you offend your digestive tract at dinner, your mother might pour you a vinegar and honey tonic. You choke it down dutifully, wincing at the oddly bracing flavor, and wonder if sleep is worth such torment. Vinegar is touted as a purifier, while honey smooths the humors. The logic offers a peculiar kind of comfort. If you cannot sleep, maybe you can at least improve your internal fluids. The Victorians, after all, adore the idea that every body problem has a culinary solution. If it turns out the only result is acid reflux and sticky lips, well, at least you have something else to ponder at midnight. What you really crave is a story of someone more desperate than you. Perhaps you've heard talk of dream pillows, stuffed not with goose down, but with a jumble of 9 different herbs. Each was believed to target a unique sleep woe. Rose petals for sadness, chamomile for nerves, yarrow for feverish thoughts, and so on. The assembly of herbs sounds more like a salad than a solution, but the routine, carefully sewing, stuffing, placing, has a meditative effect. Your hands occupy themselves, your brain follows along, and by the end you may just have tricked yourself into a drowsy calm. The mainstream fact buried in these traditions is that most cultures, Victorian or otherwise, have experimented with herbal sleep aids. The fascinating fringe tidbit: one notable recipe demanded that the herbs be gathered only by moonlight and sewn together without uttering a single word. Silent, moonlit gardening. The original mindfulness practice, perhaps. Sometimes you catch wind of the darker side of superstition. Old women caution against sleeping with your mouth open for fear of night hags or more. Practical vermin. Some say sleeping with iron, a thimble beneath your pillow, a horseshoe at the headboard, guards against such visitations. Of course, the real challenge is falling asleep while lying atop assorted bits of kitchen hardware. But anything for restful dreams, right? Others fix a crucifix above the bed, or sketch invisible protective signs against the wall with their finger before extinguishing the lamp. As with many beliefs, it's unclear where practical protection ends and fearful imagination begins. Eventually, as the candle burns low and your eyes droop, you wonder if any of this works. Maybe rest eludes you because you're lying crosswise, or you didn't drink your posset, or you missed the all-important bread ritual. Or maybe, just maybe, it's because everyone around you is equally obsessed with sleep, spinning superstitions and tricks that do more for conversation than for real relaxation. Yet each breath of lavender, each cooling pebble, each movement of salt and iron reveals more than mere credulity. For all their strangeness, these early remedies knit a community together, tying each generation to the last. As you yawn into the darkness, comforted or confounded, there's quiet assurance in knowing that your sleeplessness isn't new, and your attempts to outwit it, bread, broom, or bedtime prayer, are just one thread in a tapestry of dreams. Centuries in the making, you shuffle down a lamplit London lane, pockets a little lighter than you'd like, drawn onward endlessly by the possibility of sleep finally coming. You aren't alone. Victorian nights are restless all over. The city whispers with insomniacs, tossing in bedsteads or fussing with the new technology of sleeplessness, the patent medicine. Before you sits a counter, behind it a shopkeeper with a thick mustache and a shelf lined with bottles. each promising a gentle night of slumber. Professor Hunt's nocturnal drops, guaranteed to send you off. The packaging features moonlit cherubs and elaborate scroll work. You turn the bottle over in your hand. There is no hint of what precisely is inside, but it's the Victorian era, and the details remain a mystery, both to you and sometimes even to the professor himself. Patent medicines are everywhere, a bright symptom of the age. You'd find broadsheets, pharmacy windows, and even treatises in the hands of eager clergymen, all displaying these miracle concoctions. Something strange begins to happen. The more people worry about sleeplessness, the more bottles multiply, each one offering tranquil nights and peace of mind. There's no prescription, no stern physician's warning, only the cheerful assurance of proprietary formulas. As you shake the little bottle, you realize it's a bit like opening a Christmas cracker. There's a surprise inside, but it might not be what you hoped for. Victorian patent medicines thrive on secrecy. Patented doesn't mean patented in the legal sense. It means no one else knows what's in your mix, and you certainly aren't going to tell them. You are enticed by names like Dr. Brown's soothing syrup or Mr. Huxley's restful tonic. Each is supposedly the invention of an eminent physician or well-traveled gentleman, though the more cynical part of you can't help but notice that Dr. Brown has never been spotted in an actual surgical theater. The ingredients, that's where the magic or mischief lies. Over time, you realize Victorian chemists have a favorite set of bedtime companions: paregoric, laudanum, tinctures of opium. These are the quiet members of the sleep aid family. And perhaps less alluring, but no less prevalent, are vast quantities of alcohol. Why just fill a bottle with milk of the poppy when 3 fingers of gin will do? You sit at your bedside with a spoon and a bottle marked only with the word elixir, uncertain if you're supposed to swallow it or polish your boots with it. And here's your mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1800s, pharmacies and general stores sell thousands of these patent medicines each year, and sleep remedies account for a significant chunk of the business. Some are wildly successful. Godfrey's cordial, for instance, gains infamy as a quieting syrup for cranky infants, its chief virtue being that it's little more than a watered-down mixture of opium and treacle. Your mind drowses at the thought, an era where even teething becomes an adventure in chemical sedation. Yet, as you browse the shelves, you stumble across the first quirk: the tendency to include odd, even outlandish ingredients. Sleepy time concoctions might contain ingredients as diverse as lettuce seed. Lettuce, the salad staple, was believed to induce drowsiness in potent extracts. Powdered pearl, even beaver testicles, whose supposed slumberous virtues are now, thankfully, in permanent retirement. One elixir, sold with remarkable confidence in Manchester, offers the rare and soothing essence of poppy-dipped frogs. It is probably more poetic than pharmaceutical. You notice another bottle promising relief from nocturnal brain agitation, the sort of phrase only invented when one is desperate to sell a potion to anxious Victorians. Each label tells a tale, spinning science and speculation until you can barely recall which came first, the insomnia or the cure. A wave of drowsy curiosity washes over you as you thumb through a newspaper ad. The claims are extravagant, the testimonials glowing. Before using Dr. McAllister's slumber drops, I scarcely closed my eyes. Now I sleep by 9, proclaims Mrs. B. Hargreaves of Bristol. In smaller print, you spot a familiar phrase. Contains no injurious substances. The joke, of course, is that injurious is in the eye of the insomniac. Alcohol, laudanum, morphine, and chloroform are all common ingredients. It's only well into the next century that authorities bother to scrutinize such cheerful reassurances. You'd think a whiff of chloroform before bed would put just about anyone down for the count. Remind you to keep the smelling salts close by for the morning. The design of the bottles is half the magic. You trail your fingers over cold blue glass shaped like miniature obelisks. Some are embossed with grandiose lettering. Certified by the Royal College, probably not. And others contain beautiful little labels adorned with slumbering children or classical nymphs. You might drink half the bottle just to feel like you're part of an elegant ancient ritual. Collectors in later centuries will marvel at these bits of packaging. A fringe subset of historians even debates whether the color of the glass affected buyers' confidence in a product. Perhaps the deep blue made you feel protected, or maybe you just trusted anything bottled in something sturdy enough to double as a candlestick. Historians still argue whether these mass-marketed sleep cures really changed the course of Victorian nightly life, or if they simply made the problem more profitable for someone other than the local apothecary. It could be that this entire wave of sleep syrup fever is only a collective placebo ride. Was sleeplessness genuinely swelling, or did the miracle cure industry create more insomniacs in the process? It's one of those debates best left for modern academics squinting at crumbling advertisements by candlelight. You settle into bed, clutching a bottle, only slightly anxious about the next line in the ad. Corrects all nervous complaints, suitable for ladies and children. Let's pause to appreciate that in 1892, few things were so egalitarian as patent medicine. Everyone, from your grand aunt to the local postman's terrier, could be treated. Just a dash of syrup for Grandpa, maybe only 2 drops for the family dog. One size fits all in a charmingly alarming way. As you close your eyes, drifting just a bit, there's that gentle reminder that regulation is decades away. No one demands ingredient lists. There are no rules about age, dosage, or need. Victorian law only lightly skims the world of patent medicine, an ocean filled with dubious captains and mysterious cargo. Medical societies publish the occasional warning, but their voices are easily drowned out by the jingles and endorsements in every penny paper. It's a free-for-all worthy of a night market, if only the stakes weren't quite so high, or the hangovers so reliable. Now, the joke's on sleep itself. Your own descent into oblivion is less a natural process and more a chemical negotiation. You're an experiment, one moment away from the delicious uncertainty of Professor Hunt's herbal anodyne, or Mrs. Hawkins' unfailing billow mixture. The era's inventiveness knows no limits, room for every quirk and every dose, no matter how loud your ticking clock. And if you can't find rest tonight, there's always another bottle tomorrow. You turn, rearrange the pillows, and try to forget you've just ingested a mixture sold with more enthusiasm than science, as the Victorian world dreams on, or doesn't. Right beside you, you lie there, unmoving, peering up into the midnight shadows as the not-so-subtle gurgle of your late Victorian dinner wrestles with the longer, tighter ache of another sleepless hour. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and warmed wool, with the delicate overture of lavender sprigs crushed in your pillowcase. Of course, someone will then insisted this would balance your humors and deliver you to sleep. Because in the world of mid-century Victorians, there's no such thing as a restless night that can't be explained by that ancient, slightly moldy theory. The four humors, four sticky substances from classical medicine, lurking in your body, causing every malady under the gaslit sun, insomnia very much included. According to the prevailing wisdom that drifts from dinner tables to parlors, to the half-whispered advice passed along by candlelight, you are, quite possibly, suffering from a surfeit of yellow bile, or a scandalous lack of phlegm. Humoral theory isn't just antique science. It is the persistent ghost in the room, the murmur behind every grumbling stomach, the imaginary lever you're supposed to push or pull to get a satisfactory night's sleep. Just as Galen, the long-dead Greek, had pronounced 13 centuries ago, every disease and disorder comes down to whether the heart, liver, spleen, or brain is running a deficit or surplus of blood, black bile, yellow bile, or phlegm. Insomnia, your own personal nemesis, is no exception. It is a sign your body doesn't know the meaning of moderation. So, you begin the ritual. Maybe it starts before bed, when the family doctor, more likely to smell of gin than hospital, cautions you about the dangers of overheating the blood. Or perhaps when your mother-in-law shakes her head mournfully over her thimble of sherry and declares that you have always been too sanguine. The very words make you sleepy, or they would if your mind weren't racing far ahead, analyzing each rumored cure. The household finds itself transfixed by which bodily substance you must blame. Did you suffer a shock, meaning your black bile is up and must be drawn down by bleedings, leeches, or an alarmingly vigorous foot bath? Or did you catch an eastern wind, leaving your nerves flaccid and cold, requiring a blanket, some cinnamon, or, if you are lucky, a hot toddy disguised as medicine? Sleep, you are told, will not come until these internal seesaws are perfectly balanced. Doctors in velvet-collared coats solemnly recommend warm baths to soothe hot livers, and frigid compresses for weary heads swimming in hot blood. On some evenings, your housekeeper may mutter that your horoscope, too, points to melancholic imbalance, in case medical science isn't confusing enough already. You measure your bedtime routines with humoral precision. Soup is substituted for roast beef. Perhaps you're instructed to avoid all heating foods, meaning that spiced meats and mulled wines are out, and watery porridges make their grand and unappetizing entrance. If you are lucky, someone may suggest a small glass of milk, but only if your temperament, as assessed under flickering lamplight, is phlegmatic. Here lies the mainstream historical fact. Victorian doctors, for all their starched collars and scientific aspirations, continued to make thorough use of humoral language and prescriptions into the late 19th century, especially outside the more rarefied circles of London teaching hospitals. You watch as your own health becomes a sort of theatrical balancing act. A little too much excitement, such as reading a novel after dinner or glancing at the latest railway schedule, is rumored to stir up yellow bile. Too little food or warmth, and your blood grows dangerously thin. But every so often, a neighbor's servant shares a secret cure passed down from a great-aunt. A peculiar compress of mashed dandelion, or perhaps nightly doses of vinegar-laced bread, designed to cool the blood. Quirky, perhaps, but it is the sort of kitchen sink remedy that will have your toes to tingle with false hope as you settle, mug in hand, beneath your increasingly lumpy counterpane. You ponder whether these efforts ever work, or whether you have simply distracted yourself for another hour with the choreography of preparing for sleep. The debate, you are informed, is not settled. Historians still argue whether the humoral approach to sleep actually resulted in any measurable effect on widespread Victorian insomnia, or whether it merely provided a polite lexicon for the mysterious tides of worry and wakefulness that roll through your sleepless brain. Did the bloodletting, the endless warm drinks, and the staunch avoidance of overly exciting pastimes move the needle on anyone's actual sleep, or just offer the comfort of ritual, a sense, perhaps, of control amid the chaos of urban, industrial life? The real tedium you discover is how broad the theory becomes. Humors aren't just in the blood, they are in the air, the food, the furniture, and even the fabrics you choose to swaddle yourself with at night. Linen, allegedly, is cooling. Silk is warming. And so, you must choose your nightshirt accordingly. It's not insomnia, you joke to yourself in a rare flash of midnight humor. It's a linen emergency. Let's not forget the fringe adventures in humoral correction. One particularly persistent pamphlet promises robust rest if you place a cut onion by the bed, reasoning that the sharpness of its fumes will draw excess choler from your system. No word, of course, on whether this helps your sleep or simply ensures nobody else will visit you in your lonely attic room. Somewhere outside, a neighbor experiments with a goose feather pillow, stuffed inexplicably with anise seeds, because a friend heard it soothes the spleen. The omnipresent, syrupy smell of camphor oil leaks under your door. Your cousin's latest attempt to rehabilitate her phlegm, of course, and not, she insists, the result of burning her midnight bacon sandwiches, though historians might debate that point too. You adjust your blanket and imagine yourself like a particularly decisive alchemical cauldron. Too much black bile, and you're morose and alert. Too little, and you grow blank-eyed and dull. There's something pleasingly circular to it. You can always blame the humors, whatever your midnight fate. Bad sleep is merely a symptom, not a condemnation. Tomorrow, perhaps, you are melancholic. Next week, choleric. Never quite the master of your own biochemistry. And yet, behind the elaborate curtain of humoral advice, you notice the persistence of superstition, herbal lore, and a steady trade in increasingly hopeful concoctions. Directions for cooling the head range from dabbing vinegar on your temples to donning a cabbage leaf hat in extreme or particularly unlucky cases. Someone's elderly uncle swears by bathing his feet in mustard water to draw heat downward and thus vacate insomnia through the toes, as if the restless mind could be fooled into somnolence by a cunning trick at the ankles. You will try anything at this point, if only because the alternative is counting the revolutions of the clock, the last sheep having long since escaped your fence. The most stubborn fact you must face is that, even as London's apothecaries stuff their windows with glistening jars of newfangled chemicals, the public's first recourse will still be a diagnosis of one humor or another. Newspapers carry columns listing corrective diets for the sleepless, advising nervous women to chew angelica root and anxious men to avoid strong cheese, unless they wish their dreams to boil over. You laugh, or would, if you weren't so busy swigging your third cup of tepid barley water. If you stay very still, letting your ear follow the muffled rhythm of the city beyond your frost-licked glass, you can almost hear the perpetual debate among Victorian souls over which humor is the culprit tonight. Some opt for lengthy, sworn oaths against excitement, no thrilling penny dreadful on the nightstand, while others are persuaded that brisk Arctic walks just before bed will thicken the blood and deliver a merciful torpor. All the while, the house creaks and time dribbles on, and perhaps the only real benefit of all this humoral balancing is how elaborate, how absolutely time-consuming the routines are, distracting you gently from the problem itself. And then, in the oppressive silence, your thoughts drift. Did you, perhaps, leave the hot water bottle at the wrong end of the bed, incurring the wrath of your spleen? Have you angered your gallbladder by eating pickled onions with supper? Someone, somewhere, is scribbling another pamphlet on the dangers of peppermint water, while another prominent doctor rises to refute the trend. And in the smoky glow of the early morning, you realize the true legacy of humoral theory is not in how it fixes sleep, but in how completely it shapes the meaning of restlessness, anxiety, and the endless, passionless pastime of tossing and turning. It's not the answer you hoped for, but as the world slowly dims, and even the coal fires grow tired, there is some comfort in knowing you can always try a new routine, find a different balance, and, with enough tepid gruel and whispered recommendations, perhaps eventually lull yourself into one more tedious, history-laden, perfectly humoral Victorian slumber. You find yourself in an age when sleep is not a guarantee, but more of an ongoing battle, and the Victorians, with their flair for the innovative and the eccentric, take this nightly challenge to dizzying, sometimes hilarious heights. After all, if a problem can possibly be fixed through the application of springs, cogs, and pulleys, the Victorians are determined to try. In gaslit bedrooms crowded with paisley wallpaper and heavy velvet curtains, you look around and realize the very air vibrates with anxious, half-snored attempts at slumber, each one aided and abetted by a jumble of contraptions on nightstands, under beds, or strung up above. If you're beginning to think a little lavender oil might suffice, brace yourself. Your average Victorian sleep seeker is not content with a whiff of flowers. They want mechanics with their moonlight, and the sound of gentle ticking to lull them toward unconsciousness. Picture yourself sliding beneath a mountain of hand-stitched quilts, only for your feet to bump into something metal, cold, and oddly shaped at the end of your bed. Could it be an experimental foot warmer, perhaps? Or a clockwork cradle for your shins? The answer depends on what sort of sleep troubles you and what sort of inventor you trust. Here you are, confronted with the sleepyhead regulator, a gleaming brass gadget designed to gently agitate the mattress at 10-minute intervals. Yes, this is not a joke. In your quest for sleep, you turn a brass knob and wait. Like a fussy mechanical butler, the regulator slowly begins its work. The entire bed thrums in a low, persistent vibration, intended somehow to pacify frayed nerves. The inventor insists that these vibrations lull the body. Whether it works is debatable, but you cannot ignore the odd comfort of low-grade movement and the faint, constant clanking, which provides its own sleepy soundscape. Of course, vibrations are just one trick from the Victorian bag. Perhaps you prefer the gentle squeeze of a somnolence corset, custom-laced before bedtime. These rest braces promise to apply just enough pressure to your abdomen, supposedly massaging away insomnia by pacifying the liver. Sound suspect? Absolutely. But you give it a go, and as your breath shortens, you wonder if there's truth to the concept. Historians still argue whether any of these abdominal binders ever did anything besides dissuade people from rolling over. However, this much is fact. Sleep, for the Victorians, was a mechanical problem to be solved by ever newfangled devices. You close your eyes, only to wake again at the insistence of your room's newest acquisition, the automatic feather sprinkler. This contraption looks like it was dreamed up by a team of sleep-deprived poultry farmers. Its job is to rain down a gentle drift of goose feathers onto your pillow at set intervals through the night. The inventor's marketing pamphlet claims these caresses mimic the touch of a loving companion. But in practice, you spend more time sneezing than dozing. Still, if modern sleep masks are anything to go by, the drive to create comfort through novelty endures, even if your dreams smell faintly of barnyard. The most mainstream of sleep inventions in this period is perhaps the Jalibeata bedstead. Here we have a mattress frame fitted with iron or copper tubes, designed to be filled with mineral water, believed to infuse the air with salubrious metallic vapors. You lie back, and the frame begins to warm gently as water circulates, releasing a smell not unlike a freshly rained-upon toolbox. You breathe in, trusting the metallic tang to deliver restorative sleep. You can't help but muse on the ongoing debate. Did Victorians crave the placebo too, as much as modern folk do when they buy the latest sleep tracker? Historians still argue whether these therapeutic bedsteads worked through chemical magic or simply positive thinking. For those who fear drafts, you might position the automatic air flapper near your pillow. Imagine an elaborate fan, powered by a wind-up clock mechanism, clicking and whirring every 10 minutes. It gently undulates, stirring the air precisely toward your mouth and nose. Supposedly, it brings fresh air and banishes the noxious night vapors. But more than one user finds the resulting breeze as likely to awaken you as send you off. The patent claims for this device are bold, but the evidence, as with so many things, is a bit up in the air. Speaking of air, perhaps you'd prefer the Somnus inhaler, a mouthpiece resembling a steampunk elephant's trunk attached to a linen bag filled with rose petals, cloves, and other sleep-inducing botanicals. Each breath you take is a perfumed gasp, delicately scented in the hope that fragrance alone might work sleep's old magic. If it seems a bit outlandish, it's no more so than the earlier folk rituals of stuffing herb sachets in your pillow, as we've seen. The Victorians, halfway between superstition and science, are always happy to give novelty a try. Foot coolers also enjoy their moment in the spotlight, with the nocturnal toe chiller promising reset the temperature of the nerves. You place your feet into 2 ceramic boots, each filled with chilled spring water, and hope-numb toes bring the rest your mind refuses to accept. Yes, it feels more like prepping for a medical exam than drifting off. But for every sleep remedy today that involves aromatherapy and weighted blankets, remember, Victorians pioneered a more hands-on approach. You're feeling restless? Not to worry. The Notting Head supporter is here to offer relief for sleepless nights spent reading by candlelight. This adjustable arch, padded with eiderdown, fits snugly around your neck and chin, propping your head in a perfect doze-friendly posture, albeit at the cost of free movement. If you awaken with something resembling a crick in your neck, well, perhaps that's all part of the process. Some homes even feature sleep alcoves, ornate curtained nooks with a mechanical call bell within arm's reach. Should insomnia strike, you simply press for the household staff to fetch you yet another gadget, a fresh sachet, another quilt, or in the richer homes, a portable music box, which softly plays a selection of soporific tunes, powered by a delicate, hand-cranked motor. The gentle warble of tinny music offers its own peculiar blend of comfort and irritation. Here, you find a crucial mainstream historical fact. Mechanical music boxes, touted for their near-magical slumber-inducing powers, are still cherished family heirlooms, even if most folks today prefer Spotify playlists over clockwork serenades. You wonder sometimes about the inventiveness behind these objects, a sort of surreptitious arms race against insomnia. Some inventors, bless them, pour all their efforts into devices like the weighted sleep curtain. This apparatus is a canopy rigged with hidden lead weights designed to gently press down over the sleeper, providing what now sounds suspiciously similar to a weighted blanket. The intention? To calm nervous flutters and soothe sensitive minds. A fringe tidbit here. One version, briefly popular among London's upper crust, included an alarm system that triggered a bell if the weights became dangerously heavy, something of a safety feature to balance the potential for smothering affection. In this sea of devices, historians still argue whether Victorian society genuinely improved its collective slumber with these inventions, or simply gave anxious minds new distractions in the form of elaborate mechanical companions. The devices ranged from the widely bought. The air flapper, for instance, was advertised in national papers, to the more secretive designs that never made it beyond a few well-appointed bedrooms. A final, often overlooked device is the sleep posture frame, an adjustable wooden scaffold that promised to hold your limbs at the optimal repose. You adjust padded levers beneath your knees, wrists, and neck, all set precisely according to tracts written by self-proclaimed sleep scholars. Only, as you try to relax, it becomes distinctly clear that relaxation and immobilization are uneasy bedfellows. Still, you play along. The Victorians truly believed that mechanical alignment spurred natural drowsiness. And who are you to disagree as you drift off, or try to? Through all this, with a smile or a sigh, you realize that the true lullaby of the era might just be the faint clicking and clanking of insomnia's many enemies, the sound of determined effort, oddly comforting in its own right. If you listen carefully, somewhere between the metallic rhythm of your sleepyhead regulator or the whisper of the air flapper, the night yields not just unrest, but a curiously soothing reminder that sleep, though elusive, remains a worthy and sometimes wildly over-engineered pursuit. With one more resigned glance at your personal arsenal of sleep contrivances, you nestle deeper, amused and a little awed by the ingenuity and, let's be honest, the utter desperation of your Victorian predecessors. You imagine yourself standing before a dimly lit Victorian apothecary, the woody fragrance of dried herbs dusting the air, and each glass bottle promising one thing above all, an undisturbed, blissful night's sleep. As you peruse these glistening shelves by flickering gaslight, the old pharmacist assures you that the somnolent gifts of the era come in as many shapes as the ailments themselves. Pills, syrups, potions, powders, unguents, even lozenges with odd flavors like valerian rose and lavender mint. You reach for a squat jar labeled tincture of laudanum. It's affordable, dependable, and nearly as Victorian as a gaslit street. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, graces countless medicine chests. You can picture a weary clerk or a harried mother stirring a spoonful into water, or warm milk, bracing for the telltale warmth crawling up their arms before floaty sleep arrives. Of course, you know in hindsight, blurry with centuries of hindsight, that laudanum is more likely to knock out your reason along with your insomnia, leaving behind confusion, dependency, and sometimes worse. But the Victorians, eager for answers, ignore any whiff of risk. They simply believe that, if marketed with enough confidence and bottled with enough flourish, a spoonful surely banishes your midnight restlessness. That's a mainstream historical fact. Laudanum ruled the Victorian century as a sedative cure-all. Right next to the laudanum, you spot bottles of chloral hydrate, less poetic, more clinical, and no less potent. You're tempted to imagine this as a sort of medicinal sheep counting, except it's more like watching a herd of elephants stampede through your nervous system. There's that heavy, sweet taste, the sleepiness rushing in on a chemical tide, distinguished by medical men as artificial sleep. Chloral hydrate is all the rage by the end of the 19th century. It's what doctors give to patients who have tried and failed at every folk recipe, every kitchen brew balm. Its effects are profound enough to silence fidgeting bodies and slow-ticking clocks. But as modern medicine later discovers, chloral's risks of addiction and toxic side effects rather spoil the dream of a harmless slumber. Historians still argue whether the risks were fully understood by even the best credentialed Victorian physicians, or whether a good night's sleep was simply too valuable to question the means. You move on, eyeing brown glass jars lined up for inspection, all labeled in extravagant copperplate, promising sleep, tranquility, dream unfurling in silence. Paregoric elixir, reads one, a heartier cousin to laudanum, more opium, blended with camphor and sometimes honey, giving you a soft, fiery sleep that stretches into the morning, whether you want it or not. You picture a household with children crying, parents frazzled, a bottle of this under the bed, administered for colic but also, just sometimes, for a bit of peace. The modern answer to this is a wince, but for the Victorians, poppy sleep is a gentle mercy, an exotic echo from the East, and an everyday tool for the night. Then you observe the gentler plant-based remedies. Victorian herbalists, still uncertain about splitting the world into science and superstition, recommend valerian root. If you chew it or brew it into a grim-tasting tea, you are supposed to attain tranquil dreams. Valerian smells a bit like old socks. Let's be honest, nothing ancient or mystical about that fragrance. Still, valerian sticks around not just in the 19th century. People today still keep little bottles of those tablets next to their USB chargers. You try to imagine a time when valerian was considered powerful medicine, dosed to anxious clerks, bored spinsters, and men who overly enjoy penny dreadful before bed. But does it work? Historians and herbalists both offer a sleepy shrug. Perhaps valerian works for the non-worriers who can convince themselves that socks and boiled roots unlock Morpheus's door. You won't want to miss another odd favorite. Lettuce seed oil, distilled and sold as lactucarium, and marketed in somber bottles as lettuce opium. A fringe tidbit here. Victorian mothers would sometimes send their children into vegetable gardens, not for salads, but to gather the sap from wounding lettuce stalks, carefully squeezing cloudy droplets into little pots to be dried and mixed into doses for unruly theater-loving children up well past midnight. As you taste the stuff, bitter, earthy, barely palatable, You realize that the only thing sleep-inducing about lettuce sap is that it wears down your will to continue swallowing it. Of course, no survey of Victorian sleep sedatives would be complete without the famous bromides, potassium bromide most of all. Chemists, always excited by a new crystalline powder, tell you that a slip of bromide in your cup can soothe your nerves and dissolve your anxiety, at least in theory. Bromides are all the rage for those considered overwrought, often hysterical, which in Victorian vocabulary covers roughly 90% of the adult population, with a small cameo from fuzzy spaniels. The actual experience of bromides, though, is famously dull, a kind of blanket, not of warmth but of snowy mental static, settling your thoughts into monotony. Potassium bromide star eventually falls, not only because of side effects like acne and weird neurological tics, but because people start to realize that a powerfully boring drug is not quite the same as a truly restful sleep. Down the row of bottles you spot something more cheerful. Syrups spiked with hops and marijuana extract. Marijuana, sometimes called Indian hemp, is a mild sedative in Victorian dosing, a luxury more bohemian than medicinal. Hops, the stuff of beer, appears as yet another sleep-inducing ingredient, double sold as a tonic for digestion and a blanket for the mind. If you can ignore that punchy farmyard arum, you may find yourself nodding off, dreaming about Victorian farmers counting hop cones instead of sheep. The debate, then as now, is whether the sleepy feelings are from the hops, the alcohol, or the peace of simply having solved the day's chores. And now you stumble over a section dedicated to what the Victorians very generously called soothing syrups. Here, you'd find everything from morphine to codeine to heroin mixed into sweet, sticky concoctions. These juices were welcome companions to the sleep-challenged. You think of nervous aristocrats, overwrought schoolboys, mothers exhausted by cradling colicky infants, all soothed by a tablespoonful or two. Or, in the case of the infamous Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, enough morphine to pacify a small zoo. The real effect, you imagine, the household grows quieter, the user grows duller, and some dreams last a little too long. The mainstream historical fact here, such syrups were a routine in family medicine cabinets. Not every sedative's outcome was quite so, well, sedating. Some of the sleep tonics contained quinine, digitalis, or belladonna, promising to open the gates of sleep while actually sending harried Victorians on wild, unsettling rides of heart palpitations, hallucinations, or occasionally emergency dashes to the privy. Victorians had no FDA, and the line between sleep medicine and mild poison was as unclear as original price tags on an antique bottle. Did anyone sleep? Scholars are undecided. What's certain is that at least some of the wide-eyed patients woke up as more than just zombie extras in a period drama. If your sleep eluded you still, you might be tempted to try the botanical blends. Infusions of lavender, orange blossom, chamomile, mandrake root, and poppy petals, each one promising that heavy-limbed contentment of a baby in a cradle. These potion peddlers often appeared at markets or door to door, recounting tales of enchanted slumbers on the continent, where nobody ever woke up groggy or broke. The effect was probably more placebo than pharmacological, but the bedtime ritual of sipping a fragrant concoction became, in itself, the easiest lull. Some historians point to the persistence of these gentle teas as evidence that at least some Victorians longed for sleep as an art, not a science. And do you remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from another era's daily medicine chest? The Victorians mercifully never went quite so far with their sedatives, but don't forget, some compounds described as herbal or innocent hid remarkable ingredients, like dried beaver glands or traces of arsenic, justified, of course, by centuries of apothecary tradition. And although you're unlikely to have tried a spoonful of henbane or a drip of deadly nightshade just to claim a good night's sleep, Victorian insomniacs didn't always ask questions before they sipped. How did these many sedatives feel in the end? Some users reported dreams as vivid as novels, or a leaden, delicious calm spreading across their chests. Others feared sleep drunkenness, a fogginess in the morning, or even an accidental slide from one night's dose to a lifelong dependency. The texture of sleep, after a robust cocktail of morphine and valerian, must have felt less like rest and more like surrender. Robust, inconvenient, sometimes a little bit too permanent. They didn't really have a take two of these and call me in the morning guideline. Victorian pharmacy was, at its heart, an exuberant experiment in sleep, hope, and the willingness to risk a little headache for a night without turning and tossing. Curiously, you learn that even as a legion of soothing potions flooded the market, there remained a reverence for simple, time-honored rituals. Hot milk with nutmeg, soft music, the comfort of a trusted nightgown. You find yourself shuffling down the dim, echoing corridor of a Victorian asylum, the faint gaslight flickering, and your slippers scuffing on the meticulously scrubbed tiles. The world outside sleeps or tries to, but in here, sleeplessness is both symptom and diagnosis, a puzzle for physicians and superintendents alike. Around you, the air is tinged with a medicinal sweetness, and the scent of lavender sachets stuffed, rather optimistically, under pillowcases. If you were a sleepless Victorian, institutionalization might loom as the final response to your persistent insomnia, especially if your nights of fidgeting and groaning began to disturb the proper hush of your household. The Victorians had a knack for funneling social problems into physical spaces, and so insomnia, worn like a badge of honor among the overworked bourgeois, often landed its hardest cases here, behind heavy doors and thick brick walls. You might suppose that sleep disorders were a rare footnote in psychiatric hospitals, but these great institutions teemed with patients officially labeled restless, nervous, or melancholic, for whom nights stretched long and wakeful. Physicians took these complaints seriously, partly because sleeplessness threatened the careful order of asylum life. It could mean wandering the halls, mumbling unwanted monologues, or even urinating in decorative potted palms. Legitimately, that's in some records. Certainly not the comportment asylums wanted to showcase. The Victorian asylum was both a refuge and a test tube. Here, sleep was to be enforced, regulated, respected like an unpaid intern at a finance office. You might not want it, but you were getting it anyway. You listen as the matron turns her ring of keys, boasting that her ward's regime is scientifically designed to lull even the most obstinate non-sleeper. But what does this regime entail? First, the utmost faith in routine. Bedtime is not just a suggestion, but a fixed, almost sacred hour, marked by the chiming of clocks and the dimming of every last light, manual or electric. If you glare at the ceiling in vain, no matter The asylum is equipped to help. Nurses glide down corridors like benevolent ghosts, proffering warm milk, soothing drafts, or, if you're feeling particularly recalcitrant, instructions for a tepid bath in one of those endlessly tiled communal washrooms. Victorian doctors firmly believe an evening soak at blood temperature will coax even the most rebellious nervous system into submission, or at least soften you up for further treatment. You might hear the rattle of mechanical restraint in the next cell down, a reminder that for the most persistent insomniacs, sleep is sometimes enforced the old-fashioned way. The infamous restraint jacket gets a bad rap, and rightfully so. But in some wards, the less menacing sleeping chair, a large padded seat with a fixed headrest and wide leather straps, makes an appearance. It's not quite a spa experience, unless yours involves being gently immobilized for hours on end. Nurses monitor your breath and pulse by candlelight, their faces faintly glowing like extras in a ghost story, as they record the successes and failures of the evening regimen in their ledger books. The doctrine of environmental control reigns here. You notice heavy velvet curtains, pulled tightly to block out the raucous sounds of carriage wheels or the neighbor's disagreeable rooster. Silence, absolute, blanket-like silence, is considered essential. Some asylums experiment further, muffling floors with thick carpets and muting every footfall to create an atmosphere of dreamy torpor. Others, more experimental still, try white noise generators, which in the 19th century means complicated wind-up boxes that simulate rain or distant ocean waves, but mostly just buzz suspiciously like a ticking clock. While historians widely agree on the strictness of such regimens, there's an ongoing debate about the effectiveness of these tactics. Did these environmental interventions actually induce sleep, or just serve as elaborate set decoration for the sleep-starved? You might be surprised to learn that some Victorian asylums keep detailed nightly logs tracking every twitch and snore, determined to turn insomnia into a measurable, treatable disease. Charts record number of hours slept, incidents of nocturnal agitation, even the presence or absence of what one particularly literal-minded superintendent called midnight sobbing events. For the Victorians, the night is a landscape to be mapped and conquered with the same gusto they'd devote to drilling indoor plumbing or installing gas mantles in every home. Commonplace as sedatives were, institutions always preferred to try non-pharmaceutical measures first. When these gentle tactics fail, the bottles come out. Think tinctures of opium, chloral hydrate, or potassium bromide, administered under the watchful gaze of asylum matrons. The smells mingle: old wood, scorched heating pipes, and the sickly sweet tang of laudanum drops mixed with milk. You swallow the bitter liquid, resigning yourself to a chemically induced nap, knowing that you're part of a grand experiment in mass-produced sleep. It's hard not to feel a little rebellious, especially when you remember that outside these walls, some insomnia cures involve nothing more than a cup of watered beer and a prayer to Saint Dymphna. Even asylums aren't immune to the lure of new gadgets. Some public hospitals become unlikely showcases for the sleep-inducing marvels of the age. You pass rooms rigged with peculiar air-pumping systems, designed to circulate either bracingly fresh or heavily scented breezes, depending on whether your sleeplessness is considered a result of torpor or overexcitement. Other patients, considered delicate, are placed in private chambers where canaries sing all night, the latest theory being that birdsong, or more accurately, mechanical birdsong machines, soothes the fractious mind. Mainstream fact: in 19th century Manchester, at least one institution documented the effect of birdsong therapy on sleepless inmates, earning it an enthusiastic mention in the era's medical journals. Though the asylum is an extreme, most larger Victorian cities also experiment with public health measures designed to prevent widespread insomnia before it gets that far. You trudge past sleep hygiene clinics, bare-bones spaces where worried citizens, clutching handkerchiefs and sighing dramatically, attend public lectures on the perils of bad sleep. Strange techniques abound. One especially tenacious municipal program hands out pamphlets urging city dwellers not to nap in parlors, not to eat onions after 6, and oddly enough, to cut all toenails before dusk. The true somnolent benefits of which remain, let's say, highly speculative. The big idea is to forestall a future where half the population is lined up at the asylum gates, demanding hot milk and thick blankets. You hear talk, muted, nervous, about how class, gender, and respectability shape whether someone's insomnia is deemed normal wear and tear or a threat to public safety. Some asylum records show a distinct gender bias. Women suffering disturbed sleep are more likely to be admitted for hysteria or melancholia, while men's sleeplessness is generally chalked up to overwork or worry and treated with a cold bath and stern advice to take more exercise. Historians still argue whether these records misrepresent the actual prevalence of insomnia among the upper versus lower classes, or whether the apparent difference reflects societal values rather than data. You pause at a window, peering out into the smoky city night, and wonder, do any of these public measures actually help? For every gleaming new wing built to house sleepless patients, there are skeptics who insist that these efforts are mostly bureaucratic theater, elaborate rituals designed to distract from the plainer truth that no one, not even the most punctilious Victorian matron, can legislate true rest. Still, the existence of these institutions marks a curious shift. Sleep, once dismissed as a mere private complaint, acquires the trappings of a collective problem, something to be monitored, managed, and, if necessary, forcibly imposed. As you shuffle back to your cot, you can't help noticing the little details. The way the light through the patterned glass makes everything look softly unreal. The sound of a distant nurse humming some long-forgotten lullaby. The sour tang of sedatives mixing with the comforting prickle of wool blankets. It's all strangely, painfully ordinary, and yet, in its own way, far more grand than those snake oil sleep tonics sold at the local apothecary. Even if you're not quite ready to drift off, at least you are in good company. The Victorian era excelled in transforming everyday trials, like sleepless nights, into an institutional spectacle. Whether any of it really worked remains, like the bottom of that glass bottle of chloral, a mystery swirling somewhere between medicine and performance art. But for now, you tuck the blanket under your chin and wait, patient as a dust mote in lamplight, for the next chime of the hallway clock, or perhaps a fleeting visit from the Sandman himself. You on your way toward an unremarkable Victorian evening, heavy with the thick air of gas lamps and the hum of polite neighborhood stillness. But beneath this orderly surface, someone, perhaps you, cannot sleep. Again. And after counting out church chimes and reciting Shakespearean sonnets backward, you find yourself in the parlor, drowsy and dust-mottled, querying what on earth you've eaten, or not eaten, that might be keeping you awake. In the carefully penned household journals of middle-class Victorians, insomnia crops up with remarkable frequency, and soon enough instructions are drafted for diets, evening routines, and suppers so dull that simply reading about them has a soporific effect. You reach for the household manual, which recommends not just what to eat, but exactly how to live. If sleep is ever to arrive politely and on schedule, the first rule, banish spice. According to the earnest experts of your era, pepper and mustard are fiery, guaranteed to agitate the delicate nerves. Forget a hot bowl of chili before bed. Instead, you dine on mild, pumpkin-colored gruels. The Victorian sleep seeker's dinner is less meal and more edible caution sign. A whisper of boiled chicken, a slab of dry toast lying limply beside a cup of warm, unflavored milk. If you crave adventure, perhaps a leaf of parsley. Mainstream advice holds that heavy, seasoned foods will keep you tossing and turning. Thus, intones one 1867 etiquette manual, let the sufferer's supper be as bland as virtue itself. Blandness is your new religion. Historians agree that this was an era obsessed with dietary gentility. Beef tea reigns supreme, gently coaxed to a grayish tan, sipped slowly and unenthusiastically, until even the very act of drinking becomes an exercise in monotony. You can't help but notice that every Victorian cookbook makes chicken broth sound like a magic potion, provided you first strain away any flecks of visible flavor. And then, of course, there is the positively thrilling ritual of bedtime beverages. Hot milk, always hot, never merely warm, must be ladled slowly, occasionally with a spoonful of honey, provided that honey has not traveled more than 3 stops by train. You might also be offered barley water, which tastes precisely as exciting as its name suggests, and is as transparent as your hope for an 8-hour snooze. Occasionally, a neighbor swears by water barely colored with essence of lettuce, the more respectable relation of the poppy, minus any pleasant side effects. Legend has it that lettuce water can plunge you into dreams as deep as the River Lee, though historians still debate whether this is the power of lettuce or sheer boredom at work. On the fringe, there's vinegar. Yes, vinegar. Some claim that sipping a teaspoon of apple cider vinegar before bed is the ticket to a night of uninterrupted slumber, though at least one medical journal snidely argues this merely replaces insomnia with indigestion. Even odder, a minor self-help magazine devotes an entire column to the notion that sniffing vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs slows the racing mind. You imagine a row of 1883 insomniacs gently snuffling vinegar in the lamplight and marvel at human ingenuity, or its limits. The hour creeps closer to midnight, and the protocols expand beyond your plate. The advice columns are nothing if not comprehensive. You are strongly discouraged from reading sensation novels in bed, for fear that Wilkie Collins might overstimulate your nervous system, or, worse, leave you pining with thoughts unfit for gentle dreamers. Newspapers probably count as contraband too, lest you spend the night mentally parsing current events and the exchange rates of Baltic wheat. Instead, you are cautioned to keep your bedroom unreasonably cold, regardless of personal comfort. Cooler rooms, so they insist, encourage not just sleep, but moral fortitude. If you dare to request a hot water bottle, make sure it is only mildly warm or risk unbalancing the humors. At risk of creating scandal, open your window a tiny crack, but be careful not to inhale London's celebrated fog. now available in new and exciting chemical flavors. Your daily schedule is now a prescription. Rise with the sun. Grab a brisk walk before most of your neighbors have even let the maid rattle the coal scuttle. Eat your plain porridge and keep a cheerful outlook. Should you ever find yourself chuckling after 9 p.m., quickly stifle it. Mirth at night is toxic to the Victorian body clock. Lifestyle guidance stretches to the ultimate evening routine. You are to fold your hands, close your book, if you have been allowed one, and contemplate not your troubles, but something morally improving. Some manuals recommend silent meditation or the recitation of Sunday sermon snippets, none too entertaining naturally. Should you feel the urge to nod off mid-prayer, take it as a divine blessing and leave the rest for Sunday proper. Perhaps you dabble in hydrotherapy, the new water cure fashionable in provincial circles. Take a tepid sponge bath, carefully avoiding extremes of either heat or cold. You might even wrap a wet flannel around your forehead for 5 soothing minutes. This is said to draw down mental excitement, although precisely what excitement they believe you are harboring after a night of reading agricultural statistics remains unclear. As you lie in your austere, tucked-tight bed, you remember that one frightfully modern magazine suggests eating raw onions before bedtime to cleanse the blood and calm the nerves. Historians are divided on whether victims of this experiment suffered more agony from insomnia or from the complaints of long-suffering spouses. Still, this controversy reveals something about the state of sleep science in your era. No remedy is too odd to contemplate, particularly if it carries the weighty imprimatur of ancient Greek humoral wisdom or a distant cousin's sworn testimony. There is also the perennial debate over alcohol. The mainstream advice is to eschew anything stronger than a small glass of weak claret, consumed at least 3 hours before sleep, and ideally, not at all. But scroll through the less reputable columns, and you find endorsements for a dram of gin or an indulgence of sherry. One fringe enthusiast notes that brandy might cool the excesses of the mind, prompting you to reflect on the charming contradiction at play. When in doubt, numb yourself into oblivion. Of course, by dawn, these same periodicals darkly warn, alcohol invites the demon of unrest. As if the daily menu weren't stringent enough, the Victorians delight in creating lists. No less than 24 steps for sleep hygiene, the ritual of self-mummification before bed, socks but not too woolly, curtains but never too dark, in case a moonbeam of virtue slips through, ritual hand-washing, quiet candle snuffing, and no sudden giggling. One especially detailed diary describes scrubbing one's fingernails before sleep to remove wickedness collected during the day, which, after a lifetime of bland gruel, seems the least of your worries. Above all, you are told, avoid excessive thinking. Doctors, whose own late-night musings you suspect to be equally sleepless, warn that too much intellectual endeavor after dusk is a sure highway to night terrors. To deter those with an overactive mind, the literature recommends the penultimate Victorian cure, boredom administered carefully and in healthy homeopathic doses. One celebrated pamphlet from 1892 claims, "If the patient must think, let him count the stitches in his sheets until weariness oversets the soul." Sometimes, desperate families turn superstitious, chasing sleep with talismans or rosemary stuffed beneath pillows. A few medical cranks recommend sandwiches of brown bread and crushed poppy seeds insisting they summon dreams free of troublesome plots. But the scientific consensus, if such a thing exists in the world of 1870s sleep medicine, still leans toward the dullest prescription. Regulate your appetite, bathe in tepid water, and harness the natural narcotic of the ordinary. Of course, none of these regimens are sure to succeed. Historians still debate whether all this diligent blandness truly worked, or whether the endless repetition exhausted you into dreamlessness. Even now, experts try to unravel why so many Victorians lost sleep over the problem of losing sleep, and whether they ever cracked the somnolent code. What you're left with, then, is a legacy of oatmeal, overcautious living, and a reassuring sense that somewhere, someone is still up, sipping lettuce water at 1 a.m., swearing this time, this concoction will finally do the trick. You find yourself easing into the creak and rumble of the Victorian city at night, a soundscape of clattering horse-drawn carts, shrill whistles, distant barking, and the persistent clonk of factory machinery refusing to slumber even as the gas lamps flicker weakly in the damp air. Sleep in the countryside, you recall, had its own difficulties. Flaky midges, errant owls, maybe a neighbor's cow acting up. But this is different. Now the streets pulse underfoot. The buildings groan with new stories each night. And suddenly, insomnia isn't a rare affliction for the nervous few, but a creeping malaise shadowing the masses. You, dear sleeper, are front row for the grand era of sleeplessness. The Victorians called it the city that never sleeps, long before that phrase was cool. It's not hard to guess why. Urbanization. Factories belched steam through the midnight hours, and unfamiliar lights glowed where only darkness once resided. Here, in this churning new metropolis, your body is promised rest. Your mind, though, is stuck reliving each commotion. Trams juddering, children's voices echoing up brick valleys, even the newly introduced police rattle keeping a semi-alert peace. Sleep, you realize, is never just about closing your eyes. The very air feels different. You taste coal and metal in your mouth, and the beds are tucked so tightly with scratchy, mass-produced sheets that you start missing the uneven comfort of homemade linens. As streets filled with people from every patch of the aisles and beyond, a symphony of dialects seeps under your door, making your sleep feel increasingly foreign. Not all noises are loud. It's the constancy, the city's low-level hum, that eats away at your ability to drift off. The impact of industrialization and urbanization isn't just external. Nights become hotter, rooms smaller, and privacy more of a hope than an expectation. With the advent of mass housing, your nightly neighbors might be strangers, snorers, coughers, late-night drunks pressing their boots against thin boarding house walls. For the first time, industrial capitalism is telling you not only how to work, but also, unwittingly, how to sleep. Sometimes, badly, you're part of a new experiment, whether you want to be or not. Now, insomnia is suddenly fashionable to diagnose, discussed in pamphlets, parlor conversations, even in the bored postscript of a letter home. The city keeps me up. I hear the clacks all night. Sleep takes on a medicalized air, with well-meaning doctors pontificating on the effects of city air and gloom. Historians still argue whether these urban woes genuinely increased insomnia, or whether Victorians simply became more vocal about their lack of sleep. But one thing's for certain, remedies boomed along with the railways. If you should complain to a city physician, he might offer advice different from his country cousin. Here, there's new faith in managing your nervous system, which the city is said to jitter with relentless motion. Baths are prescribed, but the water tastes of iron and smokestacks, and you are warned not to bathe too close to midnight, or you'll lock the excitement in. One genuine historical curiosity, the streetlights. Gaslight was both a marvel and a curse. On the one hand, it banished the dark, lowering the risk of crime and vampiric neighbors, but it also glowed in through curtains, tricking your body into believing it was still evening, not true night. Flickering shadows keep your brain guessing. Is that the start of dawn, or merely a wayward lamp? Victorians didn't know about circadian rhythms, but keenly felt something wasn't quite right, and saw the new-to-market sleep masks, creatively called eye shields, promising to bestow upon the eyes the shade of the country night. You could buy them in haberdasheries right alongside mechanical mice meant to scare away urban rats. A truly multifaceted shopping experience. This is the same city, remember, where people bought hollow pillows stuffed with heather and lavender on the promise they might mimic a rural breeze. With factories running around the clock to meet new quotas, night shifts became common. If you're on such a shift, sleep must be snatched during the day, an almost ridiculous proposition in the city, where daylight is magnified by all those brightly painted shop signs and neighborly haggling that knows no curfew. Daytime sleep, so say the medical men, is qualitatively inferior. With considerable understatement, you agree. Urban air pollution, now familiar to us as smog, was commonly referred to as pea soupers, and not only did it seep into your lungs, but into drapes and bedding, making every breath and every nap taste slightly of chimney. Many city dwellers, especially the poor, had to cope with overcrowded rooms. One bed could be shared by several generations, perhaps with a boarder or two. Not exactly the stuff of sweet dreams. The great unwashed became a popular term, but you suspect the great unrested would have been just as apt. The poor didn't sleep for lack of space. The rich, ironically, started claiming they couldn't sleep due to too much excitement. Public lectures, parlor entertainments, and all sorts of clamorous social innovations. You find it slightly amusing that a sleepless upper-crust woman might complain about insomnia while attending yet another tea party, while her maid can't sleep because she must change the chamber pot at 2 a.m. The more things change, you suppose. There's a scholarly debate about whether industrial schedules, the strict hours imposed by clocks and whistles, fundamentally changed the human relationship to sleep. Some argue it uprooted the old second sleep, that middle-of-the-night interlude once filled with prayer or gentle conversation, replacing it with a desperate push for efficiency. Get your 6 hours, be ready to work by dawn. Others believe the city just laid bare the frustrations that always lurked in the shadowed corners of the sleepless mind. There's no consensus, just echoing opinions, much like the streetlights bouncing off brick. You muffle your ears with a piece of spare cotton, as was sometimes suggested by penny papers, but it does little against the sharp shriek of the train's midnight whistle. Oddly enough, one of the more charming and fringe attempts to solve urban sleep woes involved scent. A few hopeful souls would stow sprigs of thyme or rose petals under their pillows, as if delicate scents could somehow balance the fug of coal and chamber pot. A few even tried sleeping near caged birds, assuming their gentle cooing would soothe frayed nerves, a strategy with mixed results. and one you suspect involves a lot of midnight chirping. There's even one strange anecdote. Some theatrical actors claimed that keeping a slice of white bread by their window would soak up city vapors, making sleep less restless. A questionable theory, but perhaps a precursor to our modern obsession with air purifiers. As factories and tenements rose, the remedies shifted too. Urban Victorians sometimes sought solace in newly built parks or pleasure gardens, hoping an evening stroll beneath the linden trees would lull their senses enough to survive the cacophony at home. Attempts at half-hearted sleep reform appeared in newspapers. Advice for painting bedroom walls a reposeful shade of green, or placing heavy drapes over the windows to block the city's relentless glow. There were even call-outs for improved urban planning, better ventilated lodgings, less proximity to noisome slaughterhouses. Of course, most reforms lagged, as real estate and profit always ran ahead of rest and relaxation. In the background, enterprising Victorians launched new sleep clinics, sometimes a little more than well-appointed rooms where the well-heeled worried could pay to doze under strict supervision. The rest, like you, made do, with heavy drapes, heavy eyelids, and a craving for both a quieter room and a quieter era. You settle in, rubbing your bridge of your nose against the outline of the lumpy city pillow. You remind yourself that, yes, even boredom has historical context. Yours is the sleeplessness of countless city dwellers before you, the endless urban lullaby, damp with fog and faintly scented of time, played out against a ceaseless backdrop of invention and unrest. You find yourself reclining in an enormous, overstuffed bed, with a pleated canopy weighing down air ever so slightly with its swags and frills. Now it's time to become not just any Victorian, but a sleeper, perhaps an insomniac. As you lie there, you realize the fits and starts of your sleep are more than just a personal problem. They're filtered through a particular lens, that of your gender, and all the elaborate etiquette that dangles over the mid-1800s, like one of those ponderous bed valances. For what it's worth, you begin to suspect, even in your fog of sleepiness, that if you're seeking relief for your nightly woes, you will not be offered, or even expected to desire, the same comforts as your spouse, sibling, or neighbor, depending entirely on whether you are regarded as a gentlewoman or a stalwart man. Perhaps you're a Victorian woman of means, corseted and delicate, considered in need of great protection from the woes and wildness of the world. Or so the medical consensus would have you believe. Your insomnia, you're told, might be nothing more than a natural result of your delicate nerves. Perhaps your mind, fragile as a pressed flower, cannot withstand even the sound of a distant carriage clattering on the cobbles below. Womanly sleeplessness, you hear everywhere, is usually a nervous complaint, often diagnosed as hysteria, a catch-all for the mysterious, the misunderstood, and the frankly boringly routine malaise of being a woman forced to endure the tedium of another round of tepid chamomile tea after dinner. You shuffle in your lacy nightgown, head heavy, as your physician, middle-aged, bewhiskered, certain, prescribes rest. Not just any rest, but absolute rest. Mostly lying horizontally, often in dim rooms without reading or needlework, and rarely even seeing guests. Imagine this form of therapy. Your entire life becomes an extended matinee performance of pretending to nap, a duty so mundane it's almost ironic. Men, on the other hand, or rather masculine bodies considered too energetic, too vigorous, and suspiciously sleepless for any wholesome reason, are told a different bedtime story. If you are a Victorian man suffering a bout of insomnia, then your sleeplessness is less often seen as a symptom of nerves and frailty, and more as the burden of executive worries or scholarly overexertion. After all, you do have important things to contemplate: the empire, train timetables, cricket scores. Your remedy list includes not only tinctures and tonics, but strenuous routines, invigorating walks, cold baths that threaten hypothermia, and perhaps a lecture on the perils of tobacco after 8 in the evening. If you're privileged, you might even be directed towards claret or whiskey as a nightcap, the warm embrace of which is hypothesized to lull the masculine system like nothing else. It's hard not to smirk when you think about it. Men as the indomitable, rational insomniacs battling concerns of vocation and business. Women as the dainty, overtaxed flowers threatened by the existence of hand-embroidered pillowcases. And yet, these divisions sink into every remedy and every recommendation. If you're a woman, you might also be prescribed women's tonics, which, aside from being delightfully pink-hued, generally include gentler herbal ingredients, along with generous quantities of sugar syrup. Sometimes, you're urged to regularize your cycles, or perhaps try some mild opiates, just a touch for the nerves. Meanwhile, men's potions are robust, and not infrequently, a tiny bit dangerous. Mixtures with alcohol, camphor, or briskly marketed as nerve restorers containing questionable elements, such as strychnine. As you sip, you try not to think about the precise definition of a restorative, all the while remembering you should probably not operate heavy machinery. Not that machinery operation is in your repertoire, especially at 1 a.m., but a little caution never hurts. What's fascinating, and perhaps a bit exhausting in its own way, is the daily grind of routines imposed on each gender. Women are told to avoid overexcitement, which covers everything from reading novels to crossing the street without a chaperone. Their days are a quiet parade of soft slippers, muted voices, and careful avoidance of any sudden emotion. If you're lucky or unlucky, you're ushered gently toward a strict bedtime, with all lamps dimmed at the approved hour and strict limits on conversation. Men, by contrast, are prescribed brisk evening walks, alone, of course, for the sake of steely self-reflection, sometimes alongside the occasional cigar, to settle the mind, a practice whose utility is still debated among historians, with nothing better to quarrel about at academic conferences. Some cases leave the world of quirk and edge directly into the wonderfully absurd. Take, for example, documented advice given to women suffering sleeplessness. One specialist strongly advocated that married women sleep apart from their husbands, since men's excessive animal heat could disturb the more fragile feminine slumber. No doubt, this advice was sold as purely scientific, even if husbands found themselves scooting rather unhappily to the chilly guest room, muttering about the injustice. For men with insomnia, certain doctors recommended, with impressive seriousness, the strategic use of mustache wax before bed, believing the robust scent and act of application might somehow signal relaxation to the masculine brain. Historians still argue whether this was genuine medical advice or simply proof that some Victorians were gripped by late-night boredom of their very own. Class plays a role, of course, an undercurrent running through these gendered rules. An upper-class woman can afford the luxury of an extended rest cure delivered in faintly perfumed, silk-lined rooms, roused only by the gentle clinking of a silver tray of sleeping draughts. Working-class women, however, might find themselves lying awake after a day of grueling labor, with no aid besides a well-worn Bible and perhaps some advice gleaned from an elderly neighbor. Rub lavender on your wrists and hope for the best. Men of comfortable means might debate the relative merits of horsehair mattresses versus feather beds. Feather beds promote moral decay, old chap. But a dock worker simply hopes for a patch of quiet where insomnia isn't instantly interpreted as a lapse in manly fortitude. And all of it, as you slip further into your dusk-tinged reverie, is looped through the fabric of societal expectation. A sleepless woman. Perhaps she is avoiding her natural maternal duties. Or worse, succumbing to novelties like reading Penny Dreadful in dim candlelight. Tales that, it's feared, will lead to fantasy and further nerves. For men, insomnia carries the faint whiff of noble struggle, an indication of engagement with the grand concerns of the age. Yet sometimes even men's sleeplessness is treated with suspicion. Maybe it's a hint of vice, a sign that the cool, rational mind is being eroded by physical excess, or too many glasses of red at dinner. You might be wondering what happens when cases simply don't fit societal molds. A man too gentle, a woman too restless. That's where Victorian doctors got particularly creative. They might have prescribed the sea air cure for women considered too energetic, sending them to the bracing but insomnia-enhancing seaside in hopes of calming their temperaments. For men lacking in executive anxiety, physicians sometimes suggested more business responsibility as a tonic. Yes, more sleeplessness to cure sleeplessness. Whether these approaches worked is, as always, a question historians debate with limited data and even less consensus. In all of this, there is a quiet parade of contradiction, or perhaps just a gentle, drowsy absurdity. The men tuck themselves in after a day of grim business-like remedies. The women, prescribed to ignore all but the faintest wisp of excitement, fall asleep wondering about the latest village gossip, or drift in a syrupy haze from a tincture of laudanum, a substance whose relative merits and terrifying side effects make for lively discussions among modern scholars. The social mores of Victorian Britain squeeze everyone into neatly labeled sleep protocol boxes, some lined in velvet, others stuffed with straw. You become aware that, for all the debate and complexity, one fact shines quietly. The remedy often said less about what actually caused sleeplessness, and more about what Victorians thought you ought to be: restful, tranquil, and perfectly, almost suspiciously, in control. And so you lie back, caught between giggles and yawns, imagining a world where the path to sleep seems tailor-made, not for your unique trouble, but for the shape of your silhouette in candlelight, and the whisper of your slippers on the nursery rug. After all, if Victorian society had its way, even your insomnia would be dressed as properly as you. You slide beneath the covers, feeling the way every lump is pronounced, as the mattress beneath you does its best emulation of a Victorian whoop. Threads dig at your ankles, and yet you're reminded there was a time, not so far away, when simply possessing a bed was considered a major prescription for insomnia. Where you simply are now, flat and expectant, you'd be an object of envy in 18... at least among the sleep-deprived. The Victorian bed, so grand and so utterly overburdened with symbolism, provided more than physical rest. It was heralded as the ultimate sanctuary, and occasionally a rather judgmental therapist for your nocturnal shortcomings. You sensed the aura of hushed reverence demanded by Victorian bedrooms, their air perfumed by stale lavender, camphor, and the lingering hint of paraffin. Sleep experts, by that of course we mean your great-great-grandmother, insisted the right bed could bring on sleep where even laudanum failed. Victorians believed, or at least earnestly pretended, that a sturdy bed with the proper slats, dimensions, and an unforgiving mattress was akin to a physician's prescription pad. The ornate bedsteads of the era, whether resplendent with mahogany curlicues or spindly cast iron, were as much declarations of one's good taste as they were personal incubators for dreams. If your sleep still evaded you, surely the blame rested not on your anxieties or the recent potato famine, but on your bedding. Perhaps you had chosen satin ribbon over wool fringe, or failed to fluff your bolster in the prescribed clockwise motion. You drag your hand over the imaginary counterpane, marveling at how a bed in this period is never just a bed. It's a moral teacher. The notion clings to the room that beds themselves encouraged virtue, their proper use a sign of upright character. The Victorian mind busied itself with the idea that a messy, untended bed bred not only discomfort, but also spiritual malaise, insomnia as punishment for slothful habits. This bed becomes the final judge and jury in the courtroom of your conscience. If sleep doesn't arrive, well, have you really made your bed appropriately? Perhaps remorse is lumpy under your pillow. Here, you experience firsthand the remarkable feat of making sleep a purely moral choice, as if one can will oneself into slumber by sheer virtue, or more likely by the precise tuck of a hospital corner. It's worth pausing to find a sense of ironic comfort in this view. At least you're not being sentenced to a bed of nails, or one filled with dried peas, which, for the record, actually happened occasionally among religious ascetics. Beds of this era were never shy about their stature or their statements. The towering headboards, often carved to resemble nothing in particular, yet costing the average annual wage of an overworked seamstress, demanded a ritualistic approach to bedtime. You would be expected to engage in what a modern sleep coach might call a wind-down routine, changing into a nightdress of stiff lawn, sitting at the bed's edge for 5 full minutes of silent reflection. And perhaps, if you were feeling decadent, a quick psalm. Beds even made recurring cameos in Victorian novels, a not-so-subtle stand-in for the state of the character's inner world. Dickens, ever fond of the dramatic feint, sat plenty of his heroines upright in bed, clutching the coverlet. It's almost as if a made bed guaranteed a properly ordered mind, while rumpled blankets foretold a descent into mental chaos, or the temptation to read French novels after midnight. Victorian bedding technology wasn't, of course, all spiritual symbolism and bourgeois moralizing. It was also a matter of some surprisingly competitive innovation. Mainstream historians frequently point out that improvements to mattress design in the 19th century were spurred on by obsession with airs and vapors. The fear of damp, miasmatic illnesses drove families to air out bedding every morning, dragging mattresses to shaded lines, a spectacle that, if repeated in your modern apartment, would earn you at least 3 strongly worded letters from the HOA. You'd find an array of fillings to choose from: horsehair for the affluent, flock or straw for those on a tighter budget, and the ever-controversial featherbed, which divided families far more efficiently than any political argument ever could. The great debate about featherbeds, cozy and warm or stifling and suffocating, continues to have its echoes even in modern memory foam disputes. For a quirky tidbit, enter the realm of bed hangings, those heavy velvet or calico drapes that encased the Victorian sleeper like a velvet-wrapped secret. On the surface, these were practical, meant to ward off drafts, promote privacy, and optimistically keep bugs at bay. But folklore imbued them with supernatural powers. Certain patterns supposedly protected the sleeper from nightmares, and some particularly fanciful souls embroidered tiny charms into the seams to ward off sleep-stealing spirits. British parenting advice once suggested that red bed curtains help prevent nightmares, which leads you to wonder how many children, peering out from blood-red drapery, felt more terrified at bedtime than comforted. Beds also became sites of medical transformation, not just for the sick, but for the sleepless. Physicians often prescribed bed rest, not merely to the terminally ill, but as a cure-all for the frayed nerves of insomnia. Medical journals of the period are filled with patient case notes that read like a how-to manual for lying still. Ms. K, bed rest for 6 weeks, 1 glass of beef tea every 2 hours, strict avoidance of novels. You imagine the tedium, the endless hours of staring at a crack in the plaster, and wonder if sleep finally crept in purely out of boredom. The regime was so codified that for many women, especially those suffering with what doctors termed hysteria, a broad category that included, well, being a woman and also occasionally not sleeping. Bed rest was a rite of passage, albeit one rarely effective in promoting actual rest. Even the very location of the bed within the room was imbued with scientific and mystical significance. You would be advised to place the head of your bed to the north for magnetic health, to avoid alignment with the door for fear that passing ghosts would inadvertently sweep you away, and to steer clear of windows lest pernicious London fog seep into your dreams. Historians still argue whether these superstitions genuinely influenced sleep quality or merely provided Victorians with a comforting illusion of control over a fundamentally chaotic process. Still, you can appreciate the gentle madness of this nightly ritual, the bed not just as furniture, but as a compass and a ward. You feel the urge to flip your pillow. Should you be tossing and turning, fret not. Victorian handbooks brimmed with stern advice. Turn the pillow to the fresh side for renewed rest. Brush the sheets with a birch switch each morning to invigorate the fabric naturally. And above all, never ever share your bed with a pet or eccentric cousin, for fear that sleep might be siphoned off in the night like a very sluggish vampire attack. The sacredness of solo sleep was legendary, and, for some, a point of pride, unless, of course, it was the marital bed, in which case there was a separate set of regulations, some more practical than others and all shrouded in euphemism. Yet the Victorian bed, for all its functional and fanciful baggage, was also the stage for the nightly performance of trying one's best. If all else failed, you'd hope salvation lay not in medicine, but in the draping of covers, the careful arrangement of sheets, and a hopeful recitation of the family's preferred psalm. You couldn't rely on a Netflix algorithm to lull you to sleep, but you could trust in the enduring promise that, somewhere beneath those immaculately tucked layers, rest was waiting. If you could just find the right angle, the right blanket, or the right prayer, just be thankful you don't have to prop yourself up on a pyramid of half-stuffed cushions. One of those short-lived medical fads that made insomnia seem like the lesser evil. So as you nestle into that space between pressure point and pillow crease, consider the humble Victorian bed, a site of nightly drama, a silent partner in your struggle with sleep, and an enduring monument to the belief that, with enough attention to thread count and headboard height, anyone can doze off eventually. The myth lingers on, as does the hope that the next night, with the right tuck or charm, will finally bring the rest you seek. Sleep, after all, was never just about the body, but the stories we whisper under the covers. Each bed a world unto itself, promising endlessly that tonight just might be different. You stretch out on your comfortably lumpy Victorian mattress, the kind elegantly dressed for show if not for support, and close your weary eyes, but sleep takes its time arriving. Of course, you are not alone in this experience. In the flickering gaslight era, across parlors and bedchambers, the weary and wide awake reached for something older than any pharmaceutical, the humble power of storytelling. Not for nothing did Victorian parents and caregivers recount tales soft as lamplight to children too fidgety for sleep, nor did adults shy away from letting well-worn legends weave into the space between wakefulness and dreams. You settle deeper, feeling the tickle of starched nightclothes as you remember that words told just so can smooth the mind like a cool hand on a fevered brow. The belief in story as sleep tonic wasn't mere whimsy. It curled into the heart of Victorian family life, as essential as a hot mug of milk or the sleepy tick of the grandfather clock. In a time when formal education was just finding its foothold among the middle and lower classes, you might find yourself, perhaps even now, listening to a relative spin ancient fables, or those curious tales supposed to be moral lessons, but suspiciously convoluted. The idea was simple: distract your mind from the pressing cares of coal soot, factory clatter, and existential dread brought on by Charles Dickens, and perhaps rest might edge closer. You may notice that in the Victorian bedroom, these spoken narratives served not just as bedtime ritual, but almost as psychological first aid. You and your industrial-era counterparts, with nerves brittle from progress, felt the pull of what was then called overstimulation. As one wag wrote in a London magazine, modern life risked turning everyone's nerves into a frayed mop. Stories were the remedy, a gentle way to unwind one's anxious threads. One mainstream fact you might recognize is how famously Queen Victoria herself reportedly favored light historical romances for bedtime reading, supposedly to keep nightmares at bay. Proof that even monarchs need a little escapism. As you drift along on the current of the spoken word, the world outside, the trundling of horse-drawn cabs over cobblestones, the faint clamor from an opium den 2 doors down, fades by design. Victorian experts in sleep, such as they fancied themselves, lectured that occupying the mind with agreeable images could draw you from that fretful state of semi-slumber into proper rest. Some claimed it worked best when stories involved no suspense, danger, or outlandish gothic elements. Sorry, Dracula, maybe next time. The more humdrum, the better. A fox searching for grapes. A shoemaker with slightly magical shoes. Nothing to set the pulses racing. Gentle boredom, the Victorians believed, would turn out insomnia just as effectively as any herbal draft. Even the content of Victorian tales bent toward sleep, soft adventures, wandering animals, pastoral life. You might have heard the tale of the Dream Lady, a delicate sprite weaving slumber for troubled children, or the series of repetitive, cumulative stories. Think, The House That Jack Built, in which nothing really happens for several pages, and that's precisely the point. The aim, lull, not excite. It's the literary equivalent of counting sheep, only with more waistcoats. All this said, story time in the Victorian age was not the exclusive domain of children. You, as an aching adult with worries from gaslight bills to bronchial complaints, would be keenly aware of the power of a gentle narrative. It's hardly surprising, then, that popular newspapers and magazines serialized quietly meandering tales, sometimes for the explicit purpose of bedtime reading. The Victorians developed an appetite for domestic novels and stories about everyday life that were, to put it gently, not nail-biters, but instead a pleasant way to ride out the evening in slow narrative waves. Still, the popularity of the bedtime narrative had another side, the quirkier, less discussed rituals brimming below the surface. In some rural homes you might hear tales of the sleep mouse, a small toy or imagined visitor that would sprinkle slumber dust on restless children, or references to the sleep fairy who only arrived if the room was utterly, humorlessly tidy. Some believed that listening to stories at night kept away the supernatural creatures said to haunt the Victorian imagination, from fated household spirits to the nicer end of the banshee spectrum. To your modern ear, this might sound suspiciously like parents using narrative as a last-ditch effort to buy themselves some downtime. Well done, Victorians. But as with most of this era's habits, historians still argue whether these folk rituals were genuinely believed or just convenient amusements, a sort of social placebo passed down as much for the amusement of the teller as for the benefit of the insomniac listener. Did the average child really believe in the sleep mouse, or were they in on the joke playing along just to prolong bedtime and avoid the bracing chill of a shared unsprung mattress? Perhaps it depends on whether you count nodding off as evidence of faith or fatigue. Of course, you'll find that not all stories were spoken aloud. The rise of affordable printing in the 19th century meant that more households could get their hands on inexpensive chapbooks, periodicals, and serialized stories that lent themselves nicely to a drowsy evening. These were often chosen with care for their lack of excitement. You could almost say publishers ran a subtle competition whose serial installment would risk inducing the most yawns without losing repeat sales. If your literary taste ever ran toward 3 chapters of describing tea service followed by 4 chapters on a missing umbrella, you were in luck. And let's not give short shrift to one of the more fringe, oddball practices, the so-called sleep sermons. In some households, someone, often a grandfather or elderly uncle, would recount long-winded tales of minor local history in an almost comically dull monotone. Hushed laughter and rolling eyes weren't uncommon, but the tradition endured because, well, nothing brings on sleep quite like hearing about 5 generations of pig farming in Sussex. While modern bedtime podcasts aim for gentle relaxation, Victorians were on to this monotone therapy long before the trend. Hang in there, future ASM artists. These rituals and customs weren't strictly private affairs. Boarding schools, workhouses, and even the odd country asylum recorded the use of rest stories, read aloud as part of a broader attempt to create a peaceful group environment. In a world of relentless noise, the street sellers, the factory horns, the squawking geese, narrative was the quiet lull between the clamor. Picture yourself in one of these gray dormitories, listening as a matron reads from The Pilgrim's Progress or the less racy bits of Ivanhoe, her voice pooling in the corners of the gaslit room. Consider, too, the cleverness of the Victorians in using narrative as social glue. Story time was a chance to reinforce hierarchy. Papa always reads first. But it could also be a subversive act. Some storytellers slipped in sly jokes about the master, subtle reminders of a better world, or, during rare daring moments, a gentle critique of the rigid moral code. You, half asleep under the blankets, might not catch all the innuendo, but your mind soaks up the rhythms, the comfort of familiarity, and the sense of belonging. While on one level this all sounds deeply cozy, Victorian storytelling for sleep also reflected nervousness about new science. With nascent psychological theories floating around, some Victorian doctors, after all, believed a lively imagination could worsen insomnia. Debate arose about whether bedtime stories truly soothed minds, or instead kept them watchful and alert. Some periodicals from the 1880s actually cautioned parents against reading too many fairy tales at bedtime, lest children grow excitable. Still, the everyday experience said otherwise, as millions of yawns attested. There remains the lingering belief, even now, in your blinking digital blue-lit world, that words, spun at the right pitch and rhythm, can coax sleeplessness away. Victorians, for all their seriousness, understood this intuitively. So as the tale draws to a close, you realize, perhaps, they were onto something. Not every cure needs a bottle or a gadget. Sometimes, it's the quietly meandering story that brings you closest to the threshold of sleep, lulling your chattering mind into gentle silence. There's poetry in the mundane, enough, at least, to let you drift where dreams begin. You adjust your pillow and listen closer, for now you drift into the dim glow of Victorian lamplight, where scientific curiosity and chronic sleeplessness mix like lavender in a lukewarm cup of midnight tea. Just as you start to lose yourself among velvet curtains and flickering bedside lamps, it becomes clear that the insomniac Victorians, once fervent believers in superstition and patent mixtures of God knows what, began ever so cautiously to peer through the keyhole of emerging science. This is the era, after all, of Charles Darwin, Florence Nightingale, and the telegraph, not just corsets and breathless fainting. So, as you rest your tired gaze on a wobbly walnut nightstand, you notice a copy of The Lancet, or perhaps, if you're feeling rather daring, one of those mechanistic books written by Thomas Huxley. At last, science is arriving to the sleep-deprived boudoir, uninvited perhaps, but curious nonetheless. You can almost hear the chime of the clock, every half hour marked for the diligent insomniac who volunteers, once again, to experiment on their own weary body. This shift from superstition to science, as you feel, happens not with a bang, but with a ceaseless, fretful pacing across the floorboards of Victorian bedrooms. Physicians become the new priests. You, the afflicted sleeper, lie beneath their gaze and take note of the stethoscope, the thermometer, and the not-so-holy water of the pharmacist's shelf. It turns out, those endless nighttime hours become breeding grounds for new scientific observations, and sometimes even accidental discoveries, whether or not you actually want to be awake to witness them. The most straightforward place to start is with the birth of sleep as a medical subject. No longer the domain of grandmothers and their whispered remedies, sleep becomes something measurable, or at least something the men in waistcoats presume they might measure. Hygienists and emerging psychologists wonder if restless nights could be tabulated, diagnosed, and perhaps even graphed. You lose count of the times someone recommends fresh air or a strict regimen, as if your sleeplessness were a mathematical equation to be solved. Of course, that's the mainstream approach. Bring order, bring routine, and you just might lull an entire nation into slumber. In fact, by the 1880s, the notion of sleep hygiene is born, with lengthy pamphlets extolling the virtues of darkened rooms, opened windows, and the avoidance of rich puddings at supper. Historians still argue whether these scientific-minded recommendations truly improved anyone's sleep, or simply provided Victorians a new set of bedtime anxieties. Of course, the scientific revolution in the bedroom is not solely about order. It's also about experimentation. Somewhere, a university don is poking and prodding with galvanic devices, convinced that electricity just might coax the drowsiest of eyelids closed. Yes, electricity for sleep. A fringe enthusiast wires his bedposts, hoping the gentle current will lull his body into a restful doze. All you get, if you're brave enough, is a faint tingle and perhaps a ruined haircut. Yet, there are pamphlets and promising letters reporting electric somnifiers and galvanic belts, their advertisements promising dreams as smooth as mahogany. But as you now know, Victorians had a soft spot for eccentric tinkering. You wonder, sprawled under your patchwork quilt, whether someone 100 years from now will giggle at your own modern foam pillows. It isn't long before some medical minds begin to see the connection between nerves, stress, and insomnia. This is the era when nervous exhaustion becomes a household phrase, a diagnosis frequently delivered to those who perhaps just needed a more comfortable mattress. Medical journals ponder the mysteries of neurons, though they're not yet called that. Some physicians suspect that insomnia might originate in the smallest of bodily wires. They proffer treatments like bromide salts or chloral hydrate, their chalky taste signaling scientific progress with every unpalatable swallow. Here's your mainstream milestone: the prescription of hypnotics, sedatives designed specifically to round off those wakeful edges. For the first time, you might find yourself being given a little bottle with measured doses, marked instructions, a doctor's signature, and if Victorian records are any guide, the tiniest increase in dignity for sleepless sufferers. If you think this all sounds like progress, well, you're not wrong, though it's not without its own sleepy perils. Some of these new cures turn out to be sneakier than foxglove in the garden. Chloral hydrate, for example, is celebrated as the first real sleeping pill, only for doctors and their persistently sleepless patients to discover its unintended side effects: grogginess that lingers well into the next day, and sometimes worrying dependencies. But compared to earlier folk tonics, at least the side effects are consistently understood, if not always avoidable. Still, you can't help but marvel at the fact that Victorians, armed with little more than a microscope and lots of time, would systematically trial the sedatives on themselves. The The boundary between clinical trial and personal desperation grows very thin at 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, we mustn't forget the age of dreams, the one subject every insomniac craves most. By now, pioneering scientists, including a certain Sigmund Freud, take interest in mapping the workings of the subconscious. You sense a shift from, "Why can't I sleep?" to "What do my dreams mean?" And increasingly, is my insomnia trying to tell me something profound? Or perhaps it's merely trying to remind you about the unpaid coal bill. Freud famously delves into dream analysis toward the end of the Victorian era, and although his theories are met with a healthy dose of skepticism by the British medical establishment, they establish a precedent. Sleep itself is now a frontier of the mind, worthy of scientific debate. And so, as you drift toward sleep, you realize the explanation for your insomnia might reside somewhere between overstimulated nerves and unresolved psychic tension. Or, as one Victorian magazine surmised, perhaps it's simply too much beef pie. On the more practical side, scientific advances begin to change the very rhythm of Victorian nights. The introduction of gas lights and later, electric lighting extends the city day far beyond what any medieval peasant would have considered humane. Suddenly, people aren't merely kept awake by their worries, but also by the dazzling, bustling nightscape of London or Manchester. Experts debate the effect of these glowing lights, blaming artificial stimulation and the never-ending pulse of urban living for new cases of insomnia. Some even argue that the invention of reliable clocks turns sleep into a contest of minute-by-minute optimization, a race that the anxious will always lose. Oddly enough, some Victorians attempt to subvert this by resetting their routines to fit the new realities, strictly scheduling bedtime and wake-up, as though turning oneself into a factory machine would invite restful oblivion. You curl up tighter, recalling how all these scientific efforts are paired with new terminology. Doctors now speak of insomniacs rather than poor sleepers or restless spirits. This language, though heavy with medical authority, brings the strange comfort of categorization. Lonely nights gain a clinical validity. Your tossing and turning becomes a subject for experts, not just a grandmother's scold. Yet, in all of this, the boundaries of expertise remain fuzzy. Historians still argue whether these early scientific strides ever truly helped ordinary people find peace, or if they mostly served the reputation of those newfangled nerve specialists. Perhaps my favorite fringe anecdote, tucked in a little-known letter to a medical journal, tells of a gentleman who insists that tying a red ribbon to his big toe, a suggestion justified by modern theory, finally granted him sleep at last. The ribbon was, apparently, meant to interrupt unfriendly bodily currents. The fact that he decided to market his method only after 4 sleepless years is a testament to both Victorian ingenuity and desperation. Whether this counts as science or simply wishful thinking, you decide, is another matter entirely. Tonight, as you let the gentle creaks of the house settle around you, you realize that the scientific adventure into sleep was less about finding one true cure and more about multiplying the possibilities. There were journals and lectures, yes, but also late-night conversations, shadowy experiments in gaslit rooms, and advice columns splashed across the penny press. Each promised, with the optimism only Victorians could muster, to finally tame the wide-eyed beast of insomnia. And perhaps, as you nestle your chin on your hand and contemplate the curious blend of nerve tonics, electrical bed springs, and psychological theories, you suspect that the most beautiful outcome of this scientific age was not an actual cure, but the hope that new answers, however drowsy, might be just around the shadowy corner. More than a century later, as blue screens and bedtime podcasts replace gas lamps and dream journals, you cannot help but wonder, will our own midnight rituals seem just as bemusing to the future? For now, as your eyes flutter closed at last, the gentle hum of the Victorian scientific spirit keeps you companion. Somewhere between lamp-lit curiosity and the soft, forgiving dark, you stretch beneath the covers and find yourself marveling, not at the soft hum of your sleep machine or the pale blue glow of your phone screen, but at the peculiar roots of your nighttime routine. Victorian sleep remedies are not just scattered curiosities in dusty books. These strange vestiges haunt your nights in ways both subtle and surprisingly enduring. The legacy of these bygone cures is woven through the very fabric of how you and pretty much everyone else approach sleep today, and you may not even realize you're tucking in alongside generations of questionable advice. You shift in the bed, trying to picture all those ornate Victorian bedrooms filled with gadgets, glass bottles, faint herbal scents, and an unspoken fear of an empty mind at night. And somehow, it feels strikingly familiar. You might imagine that the outlandish world of Victorian patent medicines, those bitters, balms, and bizarre plant concoctions hawked by ambitious gentlemen in bowler hats, vanished completely. In reality, their spirit lives on. The impulse that produced soothing syrups and sleep elixirs now runs the pharmaceutical aisles of modern drugstores and trickles into your nightly ritual of teas labeled Sleepy or Dream Blend. You might suppose you're above it all, immune to such dated promises with their gold leaf labels and outlandish claims, but the urge for a shortcut to slumber is every bit as strong now as it was then. Some historians are still questioning whether our present addiction to sleep supplements is any less fanciful than the Victorians' trust in their morphine-laced tonics. With each click of a sleep tracker, you find echoes of the era's obsession with quantifying rest, scientifically and otherwise. Back then, manuals extolled the virtues of counting not sheep, but precise hours of healthy, unbroken rest. There was a genuine faith, almost touching in its optimism, that health and moral virtue could be measured in hours spent asleep. You might smile at the pedantic detail of those old medical books, obsessing over the number of hours an upstanding Londoner should spend in bed each night, debating whether 7 or 8 was best for vigorous colonial expansion. In your own life, the debate rages on in wearables and warring sleep experts, all tracing a faintly Victorian thread. Then there's the stubborn idea of the proper sleep environment, which has stuck around like an awkward house guest you're not sure how to ask to leave. The Victorians swore by the clean, orderly chamber, windows cracked for fresh air, bedding whisked daily into the sunlight, monotone walls for their soothing influence. You nod to yourself, realizing your own commitment to air purifiers, blackout curtains, and minimal decor, as if by copying their meticulousness, you'll keep bad dreams and bad health at bay. The mainstream legacy here is quite literal. Those who designed today's bedrooms, hotels, and Instagrammable sleep sanctuaries are still cribbing from books published in the 19th century. The skyscraper might be new, but the sleep advice is antique. And what about those unorthodox or downright laughable treatments, like sleeping on hay-filled mattresses to connect with the earth, or dabbing lavender on the pillow? an act you now repeat with 21st century essential oils you bought after watching a calming influencer. That quirky inheritance is alive each time you prepare a sleep ritual more elaborate than your actual night out. The Victorians, after all, brought an air of theater to insomnia. There was never any problem that couldn't be solved by an extra gadget, a carefully posed sleeping mask, or perhaps, most critically, a strong dose of wishful thinking. Historians still argue whether our contemporary anxieties about sleep, scrolling through articles, diagnosing us as permanently tired or chronically underslept, are a new invention or simply the Victorian age with better branding and a Wi-Fi connection. Some say the modern sleep industry is just the latest in a long line of clever marketing stunts, selling us reassurance in bottles and boxes. Others point out that while you might not be dosing yourself with laudanum-laced syrup from a mysterious apothecary, the search for the next quick fix, melatonin, CBD, sleep coaching, shows just how little things have truly changed. Perhaps the most enduring legacy, and certainly the one you feel most acutely on restless nights, is the narrative anxiety itself. The Victorians were masters of worry. They'd convinced themselves, and by extension much of the Western world, that sleep was not just healthful, but essential to maintaining one's position in society. If you lay awake counting the discolored spots on the ceiling and worrying that tomorrow's work will suffer, you're in good company. That shaky sense of self-worth bound up in productive sleep was stoked by generations of British medical reformers who measured character by how efficiently a man or woman could fall asleep at precisely 11 p.m. Many, a respectable Victorian, spent his nights lying rigidly in bed, certain that a single missed wink would doom him to professional ruin. In this, insomnia was as much a status symbol as a curse. On quieter evenings, you might, almost by accident, stumble into a more eccentric ritual, perhaps vaporizing a blend of chamomile and valerian, the way a Victorian matron once simmered her odd-smelling concoctions over a bedside flame. The lingering trace of such folk traditions keeps herbalism alive today, though you'll find it rebranded as cutting-edge plant-based wellness. That passion for natural remedies, going hand in hand with bouts of skepticism about so-called chemical cures, comes straight from Victorian anxieties about adulterated medicines and shifting scientific advice. One foot in Dionysian excess, the other in Protestant self-denial. Sound familiar? The push and pull between trust in modern medicine and a yearning for ancient wisdom is perhaps insomnia's oldest unsolved mystery. Did you ever wonder why beauty sleep is a thing? Or why you might feel faintly guilty sleeping past sunrise? These are the ghosts of Victorian moral judgments, whispering that sloth is a sign of spiritual decay. Guides of the era earnestly described how only by rising early and retiring with the sunset could one preserve both virtue and complexion. You might laugh at such superstitious rigidity, but the modern sleep health industrial complex, forever chasing the perfect 8 hours, reveals something equally obsessed. In both centuries, you're reminded, gently with a frisson of guilt, that someone, somewhere, is getting better sleep, and it's probably the Victorians, right? Or their ghosts, anyway. Part of the Victorian legacy is the peculiar elevation of the bed itself, a symbol so powerful it persists in every magazine spread, showcasing the sleep revolution. Those oversized headboards, cast iron frames, and immaculate coverlet strive to transform a basic necessity into an emblem of both prosperity and impiety. The Victorians made the bed not just a place to sleep, but a living shrine to restfulness. When you invest time choosing just the right pillow or drool over artisanal linens, you're following the gospel of 19th century household guides, though your throw blankets are probably a lot less itchy. The more you examine your own habits, the more you find the odd fingerprints of Victorian wisdom and folly pressed into your nightly life. Even the urge to endlessly research perfect sleep hygiene, to compare note cards and advice columns, feels suspiciously familiar. Your forebears built a whole genre of sleep literature out of tales of sleeplessness, from self-help journals to terrifying stories of beds haunted by the consequences of a sleepless night. The comic image of a fidgeting husband convinced his snoring wife was possessed by the night air or plagued by spicy foods endures each time you search for exotic reasons behind plain old restlessness. Of course, not all of these residues are plain to see. Lurking below the surface is the cautionary tale, the timeless warning that sleep is both precious and perilous, never entirely under your command. Just as Victorians alternately revered and feared the mysteries of unconsciousness, you quietly worry that a missed night of sleep will unravel your mind, or more likely, just leave you grumpy at breakfast. The dichotomy of faith and skepticism is still alive. One minute you're spritzing aromatherapy on your sheets, the next you're searching for peer-reviewed papers to quiet your doubts. All these threads tied together in the gentle tug of habit, caution, and hope that links your insomnia to that peculiar Victorian inheritance. Whether you drink your blue flower tea, meditate, chase away toxic dreams with sound machines, or just lie awake counting the oddities of life, you're participating in a lineage much less rational and far more amusing than you'd ever guess. The world may tell you to seek innovation, but when it comes to sleep, you're never far from the comforting, absurd shadows of the Victorians, waiting patiently at the edge of the bed, ready with a bottle, a story, or just another strange cure to try. You nestle under your own covers, the faint hush of your ceiling fan doing its best impression of a Victorian wind, and you find your mind drifting back to that endless parade of Victorian sleep woes, the pills, the prunes, the nightcaps, both the alcoholic and the woolly sort, and the ever-elusive perfect mattress. It all feels so distant, like sepia-toned ghosts drifting around your bedroom. But it's hard not to notice how many echoes still hum in your nightly routine. Somehow, the mundane specifics of Victorian insomnia, the fuss over diet, the prescribed walks and carefully calculated fresh air, the ritual of storytelling by the flicker of a candle, these details, so apparently dull on the surface, have a kind of hypnotic persistence about them. You can almost see a Victorian matron peering into your own medicine cabinet, frowning at your lavender mist, and quietly judging your lack of precisely scheduled bedtime tea. Why do these minutely ordinary, sometimes laughably overwrought details still captivate you, long after chlorodyne bottles have turned up only in vintage apothecary shops? Maybe it's because, looking back, you see a civilization collectively trying to outwit sleep itself, a fundamental part of every human existence. The Victorians would not have known blue light, but they certainly knew how worries could amplify in the silent hours, stretching across the city blocks, lit only by flickering gaslight. They tried nearly everything: strict routines, bitter drafts brewed from questionable ingredients, custom-crafted beds with elaborate springs. What's strange is how familiar much of this sounds in your own modern life. Just swap out camphor vapors for sleep podcasts, and you start to wonder if it's all a bit of an elaborate recurring dream. Reflect on how a single sleepless night could lead a Victorian into a week-long crusade across city or countryside, gathering suggestions from neighbors, doctors, and the shadiest of snake oil salesmen. They meticulously recorded when to eat, what to avoid, how to time a dose of valerian. The detail is overwhelming. One gentleman reportedly charted every hour of broken sleep for an entire year, fervently believing he'd deduce his body's chronometric secrets. Talk about dedication, or just a hobby for the chronically wide awake. Meanwhile, middle-class newspapers buzzed with new supposed breakthroughs, and whole industries sprouted to hawk miracle mattresses or restorative tinctures. Even Queen Victoria herself was rumored among some circles to have sought special feather blends for her pillow, hunting that elusive royal rest. It's dull. Yes, dull. And that's exactly why it works on a night like this. Your own worries feel almost soothingly mundane by comparison. Forget existential dread. Here's a reminder that people went to bed thinking about prunes, not planetary collapse. There is comfort in that tedium, in tracing their nightly ritual step by weary step. Some historians point out that the Victorian obsession with systematizing sleep was a brilliant coping mechanism for a rapidly changing world, one that was shifting from the flicker of firelight to the clatter of factory wheels. Others suggest it was all a bit self-indulgent, a chance for middle-class moralizing, dressed up as medical advice. Historians still argue whether the rise of published sleep diaries was a genuine breakthrough in sleep science, or just ledger fodder for restless accountants. The minute specifics, though, have a way of worming into your own routines. You sip herbal teas and dim your harsh electric luminance, rebranded as soft mood lighting. And you hear some echo of those old debates. Should you eat cheese late at night? Is the bed too soft or too firm? Is your sleep position dignified enough for a refined spirit? You feel a curious camaraderie with the poor Victorian soul, counting not sheep, but perhaps the number of sprigs of lavender tucked under a linen pillowcase. Not all of it was admirable. Let's be blunt. Victorian sleep culture could be downright unhinged. Remember the patent medicines loaded with alcohol, opiates, and ingredients best left unmentioned at your next dinner party. A mainstream fact. Chloral hydrate, one of the first widely prescribed hypnotics, was both revolutionary and notoriously dangerous, leading to a rash of accidental overdoses. And here's a fringe tidbit. Some believed that sewing a pouch of dried hops into your nightcap, right next to your scalp, let us remind you, was the ticket to dreamland, as if you might ferment a pint by osmosis while you slumber. You suspect the only thing more sleep-inducing might have been reading some of the more tiresome passages in Dr. William Acton's treatises on nocturnal health. You reach a peculiar satisfaction in seeing how their clumsy trial and error runs parallel to your own late-night scroll through 9 ways to sleep better in 2020. 24. The Victorians, just like you, toggled between earnest self-experimentation and falling for the next big fad. Yes, electric belts. Yes, dubious feather arrangements. Yes, a hearty dose of just walk around the garden and think less. Even their failures, awkward initial versions of sleep masks that were basically damp cloths, or breathing helmets fitted for maximum oxygenation carry a kind of charm. You picture a parade of exhausted Londoners shuffling about in their contraptions, universally bonded by bleary-eyed hope. Scholars puzzle over just how much all this effort helped. Did the patent pills work, or were they outpaced by the pure placebo effect? At what point did sleep hygiene drift from genuine public concern into a realm of self-replicating advice columns? Why did so many remedies hinge on discouraging excitement in women while urging men to relax through moral exertions? You can almost hear the echo of academic debate in your own mind as you lie awake, slightly smug that you've avoided both treacle lozenges and gender-specific moral instruction, at least for tonight. Yet, even though the details often stray into the comically unnecessary, like the earnest suggestion that one should count backwards from 100 using only words of Saxon etymology, there's a quiet beauty in the effort. Every little ritual, no matter how ineffective, was stitched into the nightly fabric of Victorian society. Some routines were purely symbolic, like keeping a glass of water by the bed, just in case of the thirsty demons of insomnia. Others almost accidentally bordered on real science, the slow spread of recognizing anxiety or overwork as causes rather than mere symptoms of sleeplessness. Many experts now argue that this muddling around in everything from night air to moral storytelling represented the birth pains of modern sleep medicine. You can't help but be amused by just how stubborn and methodical humans can be about securing a good night's rest. Even now, you sort of perform these same rituals, swapping paperback for pamphlet, meditation app for needlepoint. You probably, at some point, have measured the number of pillows required for optimal alignment and wondered if that was overkill, then remembered the Victorian bed apparatus and felt right at home in the long tradition of sleep-related overthinking. It's hard to ignore the symbolism, too. The bed as the quintessential Victorian object, huge, draped in layers of fabric, swaddled in expectation. Rest was a moral act. Bed was a holy sight. Today's orthopedics and memory foam pale in comparison to the sprawling, canopied sleep thrones of Victorian homes. Yet, oddly enough, your own sanctuary remains a focal point for daily hopes and minor panics. Will this be the night you finally sleep through? By now, you're starting to sense the wisdom in boring history. The more humdrum the detail, the more intimately it mirrors the quiet tedium, the waiting, the wishing, the sigh and the silence of your own nightly routine. In an age bristling with distractions, there's something distinctly calming in picturing a world where the most pressing concern after nightfall was whether goose down or horsehair stuffing produced more reliable dreams. You can relax into the knowledge that it's never really been about the perfect cure, but about the shared human condition of tiredness itself. So maybe, as you adjust your own lumpy pillow and glance at the pale drift of moonlight across your sheets, you appreciate the silent assurance that boring, repetitive, almost nonsensical sleep rituals, Victorian or modern, just might be the surest sleep aid of all. After all, if centuries of insomniacs have managed to muddle through, maybe it doesn't matter that the mysteries of sleep still outwit us some nights. The specificity, the ritual, the sheer tedium, these are their own lullabies. If the Victorians found comfort there, perhaps you can too, drifting off with their shadows at your side and letting the dullness of their bedtime preoccupations carry you gently, imperceptibly toward morning.